There is a place on this earth that science keeps returning to, not because it fits neatly into the models, not because it confirms what research is expected to find, but because it keeps breaking those models in ways that nobody quite knows how to explain without starting the whole conversation over from the beginning. It is a continent that sits at the bottom of the world, older in geological terms than almost anything else still above water, inhabited by people whose ancestry reaches so far back into time that the numbers involved stop feeling like history and start feeling like cosmology. And embedded in the blood of those people, the living descendants of the world's oldest continuous human culture, are genetic markers, molecular signatures, traces of ancestry and migration and survival that should not be there according to every model scientists built before they actually looked closely enough to see them. You have probably heard that Aboriginal Australians represent one of the oldest lineages of modern human beings on the planet. That is true, but it barely touches the surface of what the evidence actually shows. What geneticists found when they began sequencing ancient and modern Australian genomes in earnest was not just old lineage. What they found were signals pointing in directions that required entirely new frameworks to explain, connections to populations that had no business being connected, traces of genetic material from branches of the human family tree that the accepted timeline insisted could not have reached Australia, and an antiquity of settlement that pushed the date of human arrival in this continent back further than the boats and tools of that era were supposed to be capable of achieving. And underneath all of that, written in the biology of people who have been here long enough to remember the rising of seas that geologists only mapped in the 20th century, there is a story about who we are and where we came from that does not match the version most of us were taught. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. These long, slow journeys through the oldest chapters of human history are designed for exactly this moment, when you are drifting away from the noise of the day and into the quiet that deep time requires. People listen from every continent, every time zone, every kind of night. Someone in a city with the rain on the window, someone in a desert with the stars overhead, someone in winter, someone in summer, all of us connected through the same ancient questions about where we came from and what we carry. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? The questions this evidence raises are not small ones. They are not the kind of questions you can answer by adding a footnote to an existing theory and moving on. They require sitting with the uncomfortable possibility that the human story is older, stranger, and more tangled than the textbooks suggest, and that the people who have been called the most isolated population on Earth were in fact connected to a web of ancient movement and contact that reached across the southern hemisphere in ways we are only beginning to trace. They require taking seriously the possibility that blood carries memory in a more literal sense than we usually mean when we use that phrase, that the molecular record of ancient migrations, ancient encounters, ancient survivals is still readable today in the veins of living people. If you know what to look for and you are willing to follow where it leads, even when it leads somewhere inconvenient, the continent itself is the right place to start. Australia is not simply old in the way that all land is old. It is old in a way that sets it apart from almost every other landmass on Earth. The bedrock of the Australian interior, the ancient shield of stone that underlies the red centre, contains geological formations that date back more than 4 billion years. Some of the oldest known minerals on the surface of this planet were found at Jack Hills in Western Australia. Zircon crystals that formed more than 4.25 billion years ago, when the Earth was barely 200 million years past its own formation. The continent separated from the supercontinent Gondwana roughly 80 million years ago and has been drifting north ever since, slowly, at the pace of centimeters per year, carrying its cargo of ancient biology and ancient rock through time in a kind of living geological archive. The organisms that evolved here in isolation developed along lines that diverged so deeply from everything else that the continent sometimes reads less like a variation on a theme and more like an entirely separate experiment in what life can be. Into this ancient place, at some point that researchers are still arguing about, but which most now place at a minimum of 65,000 years ago, and which some evidence pushes significantly further back, human beings arrived, not by accident. not by some freak storm that swept helpless individuals across open water onto an unfamiliar shore. By choice, by design, by whatever combination of deliberate voyaging and generational curiosity and navigational knowledge had accumulated in the populations that came before. Because the crossing required to reach Australia even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, when the Sunda Shelf was exposed and the islands of Southeast Asia formed a continuous peninsula stretching far to the south, still required crossing stretches of open ocean. Not one crossing, multiple crossings, between islands that were never connected, even at the glacial maximum, over water wide enough that the destination would have been invisible from the departure point. People had to sail toward a place they could not see. The fact that they arrived means they had the navigational knowledge, the watercraft, the social organization to coordinate a voyage of discovery, 65,000 years ago or more. The implications of that alone are staggering. Modern humans only left Africa, according to the most widely accepted models, around 60 to 70,000 years ago. The people who reached Australia were almost certainly among the earliest waves of that dispersal, which means that within a few thousand years of the initial expansion out of Africa, human beings had crossed half the world and were already adapting to the ecology of a continent at the bottom of the southern hemisphere. The speed of that dispersal, the range of it, the sophistication required to execute it, these things do not match the image most people carry of early humans as barely organized bands of scavengers stumbling gradually outward from a single point of origin. These were cognitively modern people, moving fast, moving deliberately, carrying with them the knowledge and the social structures to survive arrival in a completely unfamiliar ecology. What happened after arrival is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because the people who reached Australia did not simply survive in this new environment, they thrived in it, they diversified across it. They developed ecological knowledge so precise, so granular, so deeply calibrated to the specific conditions of specific places across a continent of nearly 3 million square miles, that some researchers have described the accumulated body of traditional ecological knowledge in Aboriginal Australian cultures as representing one of the most sophisticated environmental management systems ever developed by any human population anywhere on Earth. They managed country with fire in ways that maintained species diversity and prevented the catastrophic conflagrations that now periodically devastate the same landscapes when those management practices are absent. They developed water harvesting techniques in some of the driest inhabited terrain on the planet. They built fish traps of stone, some of which have recently been dated to around 6,600 years ago and which rival in engineering sophistication anything being built elsewhere in the world at the same time. They conducted astronomy, mapping the sky with enough precision that their knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies carried practical information about seasons, about food availability, about when to travel and when to stay. And they did all of this in a landscape that was changing dramatically beneath their feet. When the first Australians arrived, the continent looked radically different from what it looks like today. Sea levels were lower by 100 meters or more. The western shelf of the continent, now submerged under the Indian Ocean, was exposed land. The area now known as the Gulf of Carpentaria was a shallow inland lake. Tasmania was connected to the mainland. The ecology supported megafauna, enormous animals that have no living equivalents, giant wombats the size of rhinoceroses, marsupial lions, enormous flightless birds, monitor lizards that dwarfed any living relative. And then those animals disappeared, over a period that researchers are still arguing about, in an extinction event that was either caused by human hunting or by climate change, or by some combination of the two. The people who came after adapted to a landscape that was already being transformed, that continued being transformed as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, flooding the coastal margins and submerging the territories that some groups had inhabited for thousands of years. Here is where the oral tradition becomes not just culturally significant, but scientifically remarkable. Researchers who have studied Aboriginal Australian stories about the landscape have found, consistently and across widely separated language groups, detailed oral accounts of geographical features that no longer exist above water. Stories about rivers, about coastlines, about islands that can be precisely matched to the bathymetric maps of the now submerged continental shelf. Stories about the flooding of land that can be dated, using oceanographic data about sea level rise after the last glacial maximum to between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. This means these stories have been accurately preserving geographical information for a minimum of 7,000 years and possibly for as long as 10,000 years. This is not myth in the dismissive sense. This is memory. A different kind of memory than writing, but demonstrably accurate across a timescale that dwarfs anything in the written historical record. And if the oral record has been preserving accurate geographical information for 10,000 years, what else has it been preserving? What else is encoded in the stories and ceremonies and knowledge systems of cultures that have been continuous in this place longer than any other human culture anywhere on Earth? This is the question that keeps researchers coming back, keeps turning what might otherwise be routine archaeological and genetic investigation into something that feels like it carries much higher stakes. Because if the memory is that old, and if the blood is even older, then what Aboriginal Australians carry in both their cultural knowledge and their genetic heritage may be the most complete record of early human history that exists anywhere on this planet. The genetics are where the story gets the most technically complex and the most surprising. For decades, the prevailing model of human genetic history grouped Aboriginal Australians with other non-African populations as descendants of the single out-of-Africa dispersal event, moving through the Middle East, along the coasts of Southern Asia, and eventually reaching Australia. Simple model, clean lineage. But when researchers began examining Aboriginal Australian genomes with more sophisticated tools, that simple model started developing complications. There were signals in the data that pointed in directions the model did not predict. Patterns of genetic variation that suggested either additional migration events that the standard model had not accounted for, or contacts with populations whose presence in the relevant regions at the relevant times was unexplained, or a depth of ancestry that exceeded what the timeline allowed. One of the most striking findings came from the analysis of ancient DNA from a lock of hair donated to a British scientist in the early 20th century by an Aboriginal Australian man in Western Australia. This hair, preserved for nearly a century and then sequenced using modern genomic techniques, produced a genome that researchers dated to a period roughly 65,000 years ago in terms of its divergence from other modern human populations. The analysis confirmed that Aboriginal Australians are descended from among the earliest dispersals of modern humans out of Africa, predating the ancestry of most other non-African populations. But it also showed patterns of genetic diversity within Australia, suggesting that the founding population had been large and varied, not a small bottlenecked group of survivors from a desperate coastal migration, but a substantial initial population that had arrived with enough genetic diversity to subsequently diversify across the continent and maintain that diversity for tens of thousands of years. That is not what you expect from a population that made a one-time crossing to an isolated continent and then stayed there. That is what you expect from a population that had multiple connection points, multiple arrival events, sustained contact with other populations over long time periods, or possibly all three. And the subsequent genetic studies, particularly those conducted in the second decade of this century, using larger sample sizes and more sophisticated analytical tools, found evidence consistent with exactly those more complicated possibilities. Signals of ancient admixture with archaic human populations. Connections to groups whose genetic signatures appear in living populations thousands of miles away, in South Asia, in Southern Africa, in the Americas. And a thread of something in the data that researchers, using careful scientific language, describe as unexplained, as requiring further investigation, as consistent with population movements that the known history of the region does not account for. The archaic admixture story is worth dwelling on because it is one of the most significant and least widely discussed findings in recent human evolutionary genetics. When researchers began examining Aboriginal Australian genomes alongside the genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans, the two archaic human species whose DNA had been sequenced from ancient remains, They found something that complicated the already complicated picture. Aboriginal Australians and people from the nearby island populations of Melanesia and Papua New Guinea carry significantly more Denisovan DNA than any other population on Earth, not traces. Not marginal signals buried in statistical noise. Measurable contributions. In some Melanesian populations, reaching as high as 5% of total genome content. That can only be explained by interbreeding between the ancestors of these populations and Denisovans. Somewhere along the migration route that ultimately led people to Australia and the islands to its north, the ancestors of those people encountered and interbred with another kind of human being. The Denisovans, named for the Siberian cave where their remains were first identified, are known almost entirely from their DNA. A finger bone, some teeth, a skull fragment, and the genome extracted from those materials. What the genome tells us is that Denisovans were a sister group to Neanderthals, separated from the Neanderthal lineage hundreds of thousands of years before either species encountered modern humans, and occupying a vast range that extended from Siberia at one end to Southeast Asia, and possibly the islands of the Southwest Pacific at the other. The Tibetan high-altitude adaptation carried in the EPAS1 gene, which allows the body to function at oxygen levels that would incapacitate most people, turns out to come from Denisovan ancestry. The Tibetan populations who carry it received it from the same population that interbred with the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians. A genetic gift from an extinct human species, preserved in living people across an enormous geographic range. What the Denisovan signal in Australian genomes means is that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, during their journey from Africa to Australia, encountered and intermixed with a population of archaic humans who were living somewhere in Southeast Asia or the islands between the mainland and Australia. These Denisovans were cognitively and culturally sophisticated enough to have been there, in that region, long enough before modern humans arrived that they had already adapted to those environments. And they interbred with the incoming modern humans in a way that left a permanent mark on the genome of every Aboriginal, Australian, and Melanesian person alive today. This meeting, this moment of contact between fully modern humans and a form of humanity that diverged from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years earlier, happened somewhere in the island chain between mainland Asia and Australia, and it shaped the genetic inheritance of the people who went on to found one of the world's most ancient and enduring human cultures. But the Denisovan signal is not the only unexpected thing in the data. There is another finding, more controversial and more difficult to explain, that has been the subject of ongoing debate in the genetics community for more than a decade. When researchers analyzed the genomes of Aboriginal Australians from northern and central parts of the continent, they found traces of genetic similarity to populations in southern Asia and southern Africa that the standard migration model predicted should not be there. Not large signals, not the kind of clear, unambiguous admixture event that the Denisovan signal represents, but persistent, reproducible patterns of shared genetic variants that keep appearing in the analysis, and that cannot be fully accounted for by the known movements of populations in and around Australia during the historical period. Some researchers have proposed that these signals reflect very ancient shared ancestry, dating back to the original dispersal out of Africa, preserved in these isolated populations while being lost in the intervening populations through subsequent waves of migration and genetic replacement. Others have proposed more recent contact events, population movements through the Indian Ocean that left genetic traces in both Australian and southern African populations. A third group of researchers has pointed out that the signals are consistent with what you would expect from a population that was not as isolated as the standard model assumes, that had sustained contact with other populations through maritime routes that left little or no archaeological trace, because the archaeological evidence of that contact is sitting on the floor of the ocean under 100 meters of water. None of these interpretations is definitively supported by the current evidence. All of them are consistent with some portion of it. And the discomfort generated by this situation, the scientific discomfort of having real data that does not fit neatly into any existing model, is part of what makes this story so interesting and so important. Because the history of science is full of moments when the data that does not fit turns out to be the data that matters most, the anomaly that, when finally explained, requires rewriting not just the footnotes but the whole chapter. One of the most thought-provoking analyses in this space came from a study published in the early 2010s that examined the genomes of Aboriginal Australians and indigenous populations from South America, from the Amazon basin specifically, and found a statistical signal of shared genetic ancestry that could not be explained by recent European or Asian migration, and that pointed toward a very ancient connection, possibly dating back to the initial peopling of the Americas, between populations whose ancestors had at some point been in contact with populations related to the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians. This finding was contested, was refined by subsequent analysis, and remains the subject of active scientific debate. But it refuses to go away entirely, keeps showing up in different forms in different datasets, suggesting that whatever is generating the signal is real, even if its interpretation remains uncertain. What would a connection between the ancestral populations of Aboriginal Australians and the ancestral populations of Native Americans mean? It would mean that the human settlement of the Americas was even more complex than the already quite complex picture that modern genetics has revealed. It would mean that multiple waves of people, carrying different genetic inheritances, reached the Americas at different times through different routes. It would mean that some of those waves were connected, genetically or ancestrally, to populations that also contributed to the founding of Aboriginal Australia. And it would mean that the Pacific Ocean, which we tend to think of as a barrier, was during some period of deep prehistory a corridor, a route along which people moved in ways that connected the southern and eastern edges of Asia with the western edge of the Americas. The deep prehistory of Pacific navigation is an area of genuine scientific mystery. We know that Polynesian people, the ancestors of the Hawaiian, Maori, Tongan, and Samoan cultures among others, were extraordinary maritime navigators who settled islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, using knowledge of stars, currents, wave patterns, and bird behavior that is still not fully understood by the oceanographers and anthropologists who have studied it. We know that Polynesians reached South America before European contact, because the sweet potato, a plant that originated in South America, was present in Polynesia well before any European ship could have carried it there, and because genetic traces of South American ancestry appear in some Polynesian populations, exactly as you would expect if there was contact and interbreeding between the two populations, we know that this contact happened roughly 800 to 1,000 years ago. But the question that the genetics of Aboriginal Australians raises is whether a much earlier version of this kind of maritime contact was happening during the initial peopling of the continent and the islands around it, 60 or 70,000 years ago, when modern humans were crossing open water to reach Australia for the first time. If they had the navigational capability to make multiple open ocean crossings to reach Australia at that time, what was the range of their movement? How far did those early maritime peoples travel? Is it possible that some branch of that population, or some population they subsequently contacted, eventually reached the Americas through a southern Pacific route that left traces in the genomes of the people who would become, tens of thousands of years later, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon? These are speculative questions. They go beyond what the current evidence can definitively support, but they are not crazy questions. They are questions that the evidence actively raises, that serious researchers are asking in peer-reviewed journals, and that the history of paleoanthropology suggests we should take seriously, rather than dismiss, just because the answer, if there is one, would require rewriting significant portions of what we think we know about the deep history of the human species. The blood that carries these signals belongs to living people. This is important to say clearly and explicitly because the scientific discussion of ancient genetics and deep ancestry sometimes drifts into abstraction in a way that loses sight of the fact that we are talking about the biological heritage of communities that are alive today, that have cultural and political stakes in how this history is told, and that have been repeatedly marginalized, harmed, and dispossessed by the societies that are now using scientific tools to study them. The genetics of Aboriginal Australians are interesting to scientists in part because this is one of the most ancient and least admixed populations on Earth. That antiquity and genetic distinctiveness exist because this population has been here, in this place, maintaining cultural continuity for a minimum of 65,000 years and possibly significantly longer. That is not a curiosity or a data point. That is an achievement, a cultural and biological survival across a span of time so vast that it encompasses essentially the entire history of modern human beings outside of Africa. When we say that what is in this blood should not be possible according to the models, we are not saying that the people are impossible or mysterious in some essentialist sense. We are saying that the models were inadequate, that the story scientists had constructed to explain human prehistory was too simple, too linear, too committed to a single dispersal event and a single route and a single timeline that could accommodate all the populations it was supposed to explain. The blood of Aboriginal Australians, and of Melanesians, and of the Andamanese, and of other populations whose deep ancestry touches parts of the story that the standard model does not fully account for, that blood is not strange. It is the standard model that was wrong. And this matters not just scientifically, but culturally and historically. Because the story of how Australia came to be inhabited, the story of who was here first and how long they have been here, and what they did during that time, is not a politically neutral story. It is a story that was shaped and distorted and weaponized in service of colonization. The people who dispossessed Aboriginal Australians of their land, who removed children from families, who suppressed languages and ceremonies and sacred knowledge, were operating within a set of beliefs about Indigenous people that denied the antiquity, the sophistication, and the continuity of Indigenous culture. The science that is now documenting what Indigenous knowledge systems have always maintained, that this culture is ancient, that this connection to country is real and deep and rooted in something more profound than sentiment, that science is doing something that extends beyond academic interest. It is correcting a record that was falsified. The question of when modern humans first arrived in Australia is still debated, but the direction the evidence has moved over the past 30 years has been consistently toward earlier dates. In the 1990s, the mainstream consensus placed the arrival at around 40,000 years ago. By the early 2000s, new dating techniques applied to sites at Lake Mungo in western New South Wales were producing dates of around 60,000 years for human burials and fire-making sites. Lake Mungo itself is a deeply significant site in this story. It is a dry lake in the outback, one of a series of ancient lakes called the Willandra Lake System that held water during the Ice Age and attracted human settlement for tens of thousands of years. The human remains found at Lake Mungo, known as Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, are among the oldest anatomically modern human remains found anywhere outside of Africa. And the rituals associated with those burials, the evidence of ochre applied to the body of Mungo Lady, the evidence of cremation for Mungo Lady, whose remains show the oldest evidence of human cremation anywhere on Earth, those rituals indicate that the people living at Lake Mungo 60,000 years ago were fully culturally modern. They were not transitional forms. They were people with ceremony, with the capacity for symbolic behavior, with the cultural frameworks that we associate with fully modern humanity. More recently, evidence from the Majidbebe rock shelter in the Northern Territory, published in a landmark 2017 study, produced dates of 65,000 years or more for the occupation of that site. The evidence included stone tools, ochre for grinding and use as pigment, and reflective materials possibly used for decoration, all associated with sediment layers dated to that period. Not everyone accepts the full implications of those dates. There are always debates in archaeology about the reliability of dating methods, about the possibility of material moving between stratigraphic layers, about the interpretation of ambiguous evidence. But the direction is consistent. The date keeps moving earlier, and the evidence of human presence at the earliest levels keeps getting clearer. What is particularly striking about the Majidbebe evidence is what it implies about the sophistication of the people who deposited it. The tools found at the lowest levels are not primitive scrapers and choppers. They include ground-edge axes, among the oldest known in the world, and finely worked stone artifacts that require significant technical skill and planning to produce. The people who made them were not newcomers fumbling with unfamiliar materials in an alien environment. They were skilled craftspeople working competently with local materials, which suggests they had been in the continent long enough to learn those materials, to develop the relevant techniques, and to establish the cultural traditions around tool production that produce consistent, recognizable forms. There is another layer to this story that most accounts of Aboriginal Australian prehistory either gloss over or omit entirely, and it concerns what happened in Australia during the middle period of the continent's human occupation, the tens of thousands of years between the initial arrival and the much more recent events of the Holocene. This is the period that is least understood, most under-researched, and most resistant to easy narrative. It is also the period during which some of the most important things about Aboriginal Australian culture, the things that make it distinctive in ways that continue to matter to the genetic and anthropological analysis, appear to have taken shape. One of the central puzzles of this middle period concerns the spread of what is called the Pama-Nyungan language family. This is the largest family of languages in Aboriginal Australia, covering roughly 75% of the continent, and including hundreds of individual languages that can be traced back to a common ancestor. The puzzle is this: the language family is not ancient in the way you might expect for a population that has been on the continent for 65,000 years. Linguistic analysis suggests that Pama-Nyungan languages began spreading across Australia around 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, which means that in the relatively recent past, a language or group of languages originating in one part of the continent spread across most of it, replacing or absorbing the languages that existed before. Something happened 4,000 to 6,000 years ago that reorganized the linguistic landscape of Australia. What was it? Researchers have proposed several possibilities. One involves a significant population expansion from a specific origin point, possibly in northern Queensland, associated with new technologies or social practices that gave certain groups competitive advantages. Another involves the spread of new subsistence practices, including the more intensive harvesting and processing of certain plant foods that required new tool types and may have supported higher population densities. A third, more controversial proposal links the Pama-Nyungan expansion to the arrival of a new population from outside Australia, specifically from the islands to the north, bringing with them not just genes but languages. This third proposal draws on genetic evidence that several research groups have found for what they describe as a gene flow event into Australia from somewhere in South or Southeast Asia approximately 4,000 years ago. This is separate from the initial founding event, 65,000 years ago. It appears to represent a later arrival of people from outside the continent who interbred with existing Aboriginal Australian populations and left both a genetic signal and, possibly, a cultural trace in the linguistic record. Along with this genetic signal, researchers have documented the arrival in Australia at roughly the same time period of two things that had not previously been present on the continent: the dingo, a wild dog that is descended from a South or Southeast Asian ancestor, and a specific style of stone tool known as backed artifacts, small geometric stone tools that represent a technological tradition with clear parallels in South Asian archaeological records. The dingo is particularly interesting because dogs were domesticated from wolves in Eurasia, not in Australia. Australia has no native wolves. For a dog to appear in Australia 4,000 years ago, it had to have been brought there by people who came from a region where dogs existed. Those people left genetic traces. They may have left linguistic traces. They certainly left zoological traces in the form of an animal that went on to become one of the most ecologically significant predators in Australia, eventually suppressing or displacing the thylacine on the mainland, which went extinct on the Australian mainland roughly 2,000 years ago, precisely when the dingo was establishing itself across the continent. What this means is that Aboriginal Australian culture, as we know it from historical and ethnographic accounts, is itself the product of multiple waves of human movement, not a single founding event that produced a static population over 60,000 years. The cultures, the languages, The social structures that were observed and recorded by European settlers and anthropologists from the 18th century onward represent the synthesis of tens of thousands of years of internal development and at least one documented later contact with outside populations. This does not make those cultures less ancient or less sophisticated. It makes them more complex, more dynamic, more the product of active human agency and cultural evolution than the static primitive stereotype that colonial ideology projected onto them. The sacred geography of Australia is one of the places where this long history becomes most tangible, most present, most impossible to dismiss as merely metaphorical. The concept of the dreaming, often translated as dream time in English, and almost always inadequately translated, regardless of how it is rendered, describes a way of understanding the relationship between time, place, meaning, and identity that is specific to Aboriginal Australian cultures. But that touches on questions about the nature of reality and human belonging in the world that are universal. The dreaming does not describe a past that is over. It describes a foundational reality that is ongoing, that is present in the landscape itself, encoded in the shapes of hills and the courses of rivers and the formations of rock, and that is accessible through ceremony, through song, through the proper maintenance of relationships with specific places that are understood as living beings with their own histories and their own requirements. The songlines are the most famous expression of this geography. These are networks of paths that crisscross the continent, each path associated with a specific sequence of songs that describe the landscape in detail, marking waterholes, rock formations, sacred sites, and territorial boundaries in a form that functions simultaneously as map, as oral history, as property deed, and as sacred text. A person who knows the songlines relevant to a particular route can navigate that route using the songs alone, identifying landmarks by the descriptions embedded in the song, even if they have never personally traveled that path. And the songs encode not just geographical information, but ecological information. Information about which animals are found where and in what seasons, about which plants grow near particular formations, about the behavior of water in the landscape. The songlines are an integrated knowledge system that exists in a form uniquely adapted to the conditions of oral transmission across enormous distances and very long time periods. Researchers who have attempted to date the origin of specific songlines using geological and ecological evidence have reached conclusions that should be astonishing to anyone who has not been paying attention to this field. Some songlines appear to encode information about landscape features whose formation can be dated to tens of thousands of years ago. There are stories about volcanic eruptions that match the locations and approximate timescales of actual geological events. There are stories about the behavior of specific rivers that correspond to hydrological conditions that existed during the last ice age. There are, as mentioned earlier, detailed accounts of the flooding of coastal territories that can be matched to the known history of sea level rise after the glacial maximum. These are not symbolic or mythological descriptions of general natural processes. They are specific accounts of specific events at specific locations that happened already Geo, and that have been preserved with sufficient accuracy to be recognized and verified by geologists and oceanographers working from independent data. The volcanic eruption stories are particularly striking. Several separate Aboriginal groups across southeastern Australia maintain oral traditions about specific volcanic events that match eruptions that can be dated to between 10,000 and 37,000 years ago. One story from the Jab Wurrung people of Western Victoria describes the formation of Mount Eccles, a volcanic feature whose formation has been dated to approximately 30,000 years ago. The story describes the event in terms that match what geologists know about the character of this type of eruption. Similar stories exist for other volcanic features in the region. The most parsimonious explanation for the existence of accurate oral accounts of geological events 30,000 years old is that the events happened, that people were there when they happened, that they created stories about what they witnessed, and that those stories were then transmitted with sufficient accuracy across 30,000 years of oral tradition to be recognizable today. 30,000 years. Let that settle for a moment. The oldest written text in human history is approximately 5,000 years old. The written historical record of ancient Egypt, one of the earliest literate civilizations, goes back perhaps 4,500 years. The oral record of Aboriginal Australian cultures appears to be preserving accurate information from a period 6 times more ancient than the oldest written records anywhere on Earth. This is not a coincidence or an accident. This is the result of cultural systems specifically designed to preserve and transmit knowledge across very long time periods. Systems that use ceremony, song, dance, visual art, and the repeated practice of knowledge in context to ensure that information does not degrade in the way that unstructured oral transmission would allow. These are technologies of memory, and they are extraordinarily effective. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Aboriginal Australian cultures is another dimension of this same phenomenon. Aboriginal Australians were not simply observing the sky. They were systematically tracking the movements of celestial objects and encoding the results of those observations in cultural forms that allowed the information to be preserved and applied over long time periods. The relationship between the rising and setting positions of stars and the availability of particular food sources in particular seasons is one example of this. The Pleiades star cluster, which appears in the sky at different positions at different times of year, is associated in multiple Aboriginal Australian traditions with the timing of specific seasonal activities, including the hatching of particular species of fish eggs and the availability of certain plant foods. The astronomical observation drives the ecological calendar, drives the subsistence practice, and all three are encoded in the cultural knowledge associated with that star cluster. Aboriginal Australian astronomy also includes what is sometimes called dark constellation astronomy, the practice of identifying meaningful shapes not in the stars themselves, but in the dark patches of the Milky Way, the regions of obscured sky created by the dust clouds and nebulae that block the light of more distant stars. Where European and other Western astronomical traditions identified constellations in the patterns of visible stars, many Aboriginal Australian traditions identified figures in the dark shapes between the stars, and these dark constellation figures have their own associated stories and their own connections to seasonal and ecological knowledge. This represents a genuinely different astronomical tradition from any other known system, and it reflects both the exceptional clarity of the Australian night sky and the extended period of systematic sky observation that Aboriginal cultures have had to develop their particular way of making sense of what they see there. What all of this accumulates toward is a picture of a human culture that has been refining and developing and preserving sophisticated knowledge systems for so long, and in such continuity, that it has produced something genuinely unique in human history. Not better or worse than other human cultural traditions in some absolute sense, but different in ways that reflect the specific conditions of extreme antiquity and relative isolation, combined with the specific challenges and opportunities of the Australian environment. The knowledge that exists in these cultures is not merely historical artifact. It is functional knowledge about how to live in this landscape, how to maintain the relationships with country that keep both human communities and the ecosystems they depend on healthy and resilient. And it is knowledge that is increasingly relevant to a world trying to figure out how to live sustainably on a planet whose limits are becoming impossible to ignore. The story of how that knowledge came to be marginalized, dismissed, and nearly destroyed is a story that sits alongside the scientific story of ancient genetics and deep ancestry, and that cannot be fully understood without it. The arrival of British colonists in 1788 initiated a process of dispossession, violence, and cultural suppression that nearly broke what had been continuous for 65,000 years. The destruction was not accidental. It was systematic, and in many respects deliberate, driven by an ideology that classified Aboriginal Australians as less than fully human, as primitives who had never developed the social and cultural complexity that, in European thinking, justified claims to land and sovereignty. The fact that this ideology was wrong, that it was based on ignorance and self-serving misrepresentation rather than honest observation, did not make it any less effective as a tool of dispossession. The removal of children from families, known as the stolen generations, targeted specifically the cultural transmission systems that preserved ancient knowledge. Children who were removed from their communities and raised in European institutions or foster families lost access not just to language but to the entire social context within which accumulated knowledge of their culture was embedded and transmitted. The ceremonies that encoded ecological information were suppressed or driven underground. The song sequences that mapped the landscape were interrupted when the communities that maintained them were forcibly relocated or disrupted by the cattle industry that seized their country. Sacred sites were damaged or destroyed, sometimes by ignorance and sometimes deliberately. The damage to the knowledge transmission systems was enormous and in some cases irreversible. What survived, and what has been reclaimed in the decades since the Australian government's formal policy of assimilation was abandoned in the 1970s, testifies to the extraordinary resilience of both the people and the cultural systems. Language revival programs have brought several nearly extinct Aboriginal languages back into regular use. Cultural centres and community-controlled organisations are working to document, preserve and transmit traditional knowledge. Native title legislation, imperfect and inadequate as it is, has restored to some Aboriginal communities a degree of legal recognition of their relationship to country. And the science, the genetics, and the archaeology, and the linguistics has in the past 3 decades increasingly confirmed what Indigenous knowledge systems have always maintained, that this is the oldest continuing human culture on Earth, that the knowledge it carries about this landscape is real and deep and accurate, and that the connection between these people and this country is not metaphorical but biological, cultural, and existential in a way that has no parallel anywhere else in the world. The specific genetic findings that the title of this journey gestures toward, the things in the blood that should not be possible, deserve to be laid out carefully, because this is where the story moves from, the genuinely established and well-documented, into territory that remains scientifically contested, in ways that are intellectually interesting, rather than merely uncertain. These are not fringe theories. They are peer-reviewed findings published in serious journals by serious researchers, and the debate around them is a real scientific debate about methodology and interpretation, not a debate about whether the underlying findings are real. The first of these involves a cluster of genetic variants found in Aboriginal Australians that show unusual patterns of sequence similarity with certain archaic human genomes beyond the Denisovan contribution already discussed. Specifically, some analyses of Aboriginal Australian and Papuan genomes have found what appear to be signals of very ancient introgression from a population that is neither Neanderthal nor Denisovan as we currently understand those terms, but that represents some third archaic human population, possibly related to or overlapping with one of those known species, but distinct enough to generate a separate statistical signal. This has been described as ghost DNA in some of the literature, borrowing a term from the analysis of genomes where a contributor population has not been directly identified from physical remains, but whose genetic contribution is statistically detectable in the genomes of living or ancient people. What this would mean, if confirmed, is that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians interbred not with one archaic human population, but with at least 2, and possibly 3, during the period of their migration from Africa to Australia. It would mean that the founding population of Aboriginal Australia was not made up of fully modern humans in the simple sense, but was genetically composite in ways that included significant contributions from multiple earlier human lineages. And it would raise the question of where exactly these encounters happened. The geography of the migration route from Africa to Australia passes through the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Neanderthals were present in the Middle East and Western Asia. Denisovans were present in Siberia and appear to have extended into Southeast Asia. But the possible third archaic population that some analyses have detected does not match what we know of either species, and it would require either an as-yet undiscovered archaic species in Asia or a much more complex pattern of archaic human diversity in that region than current fossil evidence reveals. Fossil evidence from Southeast Asia and the islands between the mainland and Australia suggests that archaic human forms may indeed have persisted in that region longer than they did further west. The hobbit humans of Flores, Homo floresiensis, survived until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly later, on a small island in what is now Indonesia. Their relationship to other human species is itself debated, but their presence in the island chain that modern humans crossed to reach Australia raises the obvious question of contact. Did the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians encounter the hobbits? Did they interbreed? The diminutive stature and highly derived anatomy of Homo floresiensis might have produced a distinctive genetic signal quite different from either Neanderthals or Denisovans, and it is at least possible that some of what is showing up in the ghost DNA analyses represents exactly this kind of contact. The answer, for now, is that nobody knows. The genetic signals are real, but their interpretation is uncertain. Future ancient DNA analysis from Southeast Asian sites could potentially resolve the question by either confirming or ruling out the expected genetic profiles of the candidate populations. But the technology to extract and sequence ancient DNA from the hot, humid environment of tropical Southeast Asia is still developing, and the fossil record from that region is fragmentary enough that there may be populations we have not identified from physical remains at all. The second major unexpected finding concerns the relationship between Aboriginal Australian genomes and certain genomic signatures found in indigenous South American populations, specifically in the Amazon basin. This finding, first reported in detail by David Reich and colleagues at Harvard in 2015, caused significant controversy and has subsequently been the subject of ongoing analysis and debate. The initial report described a population signal that the researchers named Population Y after the Tupi word Ipiquera, meaning ancestor, which appears in the genomes of certain Amazonian groups, and which shows statistical similarity to Aboriginal Australians and Andaman Islanders, rather than to the predominantly Northeast Asian ancestry that characterizes most native American genomes. The researchers were careful to say what they did not mean. They were not proposing that Aboriginal Australians physically traveled to the Amazon. They were not proposing that the connection was recent. What they found was a statistical signature in the data consistent with the ancestors of certain Amazonian people having passed through a population that shared genetic ancestry with the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians at some point in the deep past, possibly during the migration that eventually led people across the Bering Land Bridge and into the Americas. This could mean that one of the early waves of people entering the Americas came from a source population that was itself related to the founding population of Aboriginal Australia, or that was part of a broader population cluster in Southeast or South Asia that contributed to both the Australian founding and the American founding in ways that have left correlated traces in both resulting populations. Subsequent analysis has produced mixed results. Some studies have found similar signals when they look for them. Others have not found them, or have found them to be weaker and less clearly defined than the initial report suggested. The debate is about both the statistical methods used to detect these signals and the sample sizes and population coverage available for the analysis. What makes it difficult to resolve is partly the genuine complexity of the demographic history being modeled, and partly the political sensitivity of any finding that appears to challenge the established archaeological and genetic consensus on how the Americas were peopled. Because the implications of Population Y, if the signal is real and if the interpretation being given to it is correct, go beyond academic interest. They suggest that the Americas were peopled not once, but multiple times, by at least two genetically distinct source populations that arrived at different times through routes that may not have been identical. The dominant signal in Native American genomes derives from populations that cross the Bering Land Bridge from northeastern Asia and that have close genetic relatives in Siberia and East Asia. But if Population Y represents a genuinely distinct earlier wave, its source population was different. Its route may have been different, and the nature of its relationship to the more numerically dominant Northeast Asian wave is completely unknown. Some researchers have proposed a coastal Pacific route as a possible means by which a Population Y-related group could have reached the Americas without leaving the clear genetic signature of a Beringian crossing. The Pacific coast route has been proposed for the primary peopling of the Americas as well, and there is some archaeological evidence consistent with it, including the early presence of humans in South America, particularly at Monte Verde in Chile, which dates to around 15,000 years ago. That is somewhat difficult to reconcile with a strictly overland Beringian route, given the dates and distances involved. A small boat using Pacific coastal currents could, in theory, have carried a founding population from somewhere in Southeast Asia down the coast of the Pacific in a time frame consistent with the available archaeological evidence. This sounds speculative, and it is. But the deep-sea voyaging capability of the people who crossed to Australia 65,000 years ago, which is a documented fact, places this kind of speculation on somewhat firmer ground than it would otherwise occupy. If people were crossing open ocean to reach Australia 65,000 years ago, the possibility that people were crossing the Pacific, or portions of it, at other times in the deep past is not inherently absurd. The absence of clear evidence is partly a function of the fact that ocean routes leave almost no archaeological trace, particularly when the sites used as waypoints are now submerged under post-glacial sea level rise. The third finding that belongs in this discussion is more recently documented, and in some ways more straightforwardly interpretable than the first two, but no less significant in terms of what it implies. Researchers analyzing ancient DNA from sites in southern Africa have found genetic signatures in some late Stone Age South African populations that suggest connections to a population cluster related to present-day Aboriginal, Australians and Andaman Islanders. This is the mirror image of the signal found in Australian genomes, pointing towards South African connections. The most parsimonious explanation is that both signals reflect a very ancient, shared genetic heritage, dating back to the period just after the initial out-of-Africa dispersal, when the populations that would eventually give rise to the founders of Aboriginal Australia and some of the populations in southern Africa still shared a common genetic ancestry through a group that has since disappeared as a distinct population. This ancient population, which some researchers have tentatively named the Australasian or Basal Eurasian-related population, would have been one of the earliest groups to diverge from the main stem of the out-of-Africa dispersal. Its descendants contributed to the founding of Aboriginal Australia and left traces in ancient South African genomes that are detectable in the DNA of people who lived there tens of thousands of years ago. The implication is that the first dispersal out of Africa was not a single stream moving in a single direction, but a branching event that sent different populations in different directions quite early, with some branches heading south and east towards Southeast Asia and eventually Australia, while others headed north and west into the Middle East and eventually Europe and Central Asia. This more complex picture of the early dispersal is consistent with recent archaeological evidence, suggesting that modern humans were present in multiple locations outside Africa earlier than the main dispersal event is traditionally placed. Modern human remains or artifacts attributed to modern humans have been found in sites in Israel dating to about 180,000 years ago, in sites in Greece dating to around 210,000 years ago, and in sites in China with dates that some researchers place at 80,000 years ago or more. If modern humans were leaving Africa in multiple waves and at multiple times, not in a single dispersal event around 60,000 years ago, then the genetic picture of living populations reflecting these multiple dispersals would be exactly as complicated as the data actually appears to be. The story that is emerging from all of this evidence is not a simple story. It does not have a clean narrative arc with a single protagonist and a clear chronology. It is a story of a species that kept moving, kept mixing, kept adapting, kept leaving traces of itself in places and populations that the conventional timeline did not predict, and that is still in the process of being understood. The blood of Aboriginal Australians is one of the primary documents in this investigation, not because Indigenous Australians are objects of study, but because the biological record they carry is extraordinarily ancient and extraordinarily continuous, and because that continuity makes it possible to read a depth of history that is simply not accessible in the genomes of populations, whose ancestry has been more thoroughly churned by the waves of subsequent migration and admixture that have swept through every other region of the world. Consider what it means to have a genome whose deep ancestry has not been significantly disrupted for 65,000 years. In the rest of the world, the genetic landscape has been remade multiple times since the initial out-of-Africa dispersal. The expansion of farming populations out of the Middle East and East Asia overwrote much of the hunter-gatherer ancestry of Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia in the Neolithic period. The expansion of Bantu-speaking agricultural populations out of West Africa remade the genetic landscape of sub-Saharan Africa in the past 3,000 years. The Indo-European expansion reorganized the genetic structure of South Asia, Central Asia, and Europe in the Bronze Age. These events were massive, continent-spanning demographic transformations that left very few corners of the world where the genetic signatures of the populations that were there before the agriculture revolution are still clearly visible. Australia is one of those corners, not because nothing happened here in the past 10 to 15,000 years, but because even with the documented gene flow event 4,000 years ago, the overall ancestry of Aboriginal Australian populations remains overwhelmingly continuous with the founding population of 65,000 years ago. The signal of that founding event, the genetic heritage of the people who crossed the open ocean and first walked on Australian soil, when woolly mammoths still walked on European soil, is still present and still detectable in the blood of living people. That is what makes it a window. That is what makes it, from a scientific perspective, so valuable and so surprising. It is a piece of the original genetic architecture of modern humanity, preserved against the odds, kept intact by the combination of geography and cultural continuity, available to be read if we bring the right tools to the task. There is a moment in the investigation of ancient genetics where the data stops being abstract and becomes personal in a way that changes the emotional register of the inquiry entirely. It is the moment when a specific ancient genome, extracted from a specific physical remain, is analyzed in enough detail to reveal information not just about a population, but about an individual person. Their ancestry, their disease susceptibility, their eye color, something of what they looked like, whether they had the ability to digest lactose or metabolize certain compounds. The ancient person becomes, in a limited but real sense, known. They stop being data and start being someone. This happened with the ancient Mungo man remains and with the hair sample from the Western Australian man donated in the early 20th century. It happened more recently with several ancient Australian genomes extracted from skeletal remains through collaborative projects between geneticists and Aboriginal communities, projects designed to ensure that the knowledge generated by the research is returned to the communities whose ancestors are being studied rather than simply extracted for the benefit of outside researchers. These collaborative models represent a significant shift in the practice of ancient genomics and reflect a broader reckoning in the scientific community with the history of research that treated Indigenous peoples and their remains as raw material for academic production without consent or benefit sharing. The results of these analyses have been striking in ways beyond the population-level findings already discussed. The ancient Australian genomes show patterns of genetic diversity that suggest the founding population was not only larger than the minimum required to found a viable population, but also structured, meaning it was divided into distinct subgroups that maintained some degree of genetic separation from each other, even as they shared a continent. This structure is consistent with the known linguistic and cultural diversity of Aboriginal Australia, which includes hundreds of distinct languages and language families, and a social organization based on complex kinship systems that regulated intermarriage in ways that would maintain genetic distinctiveness between neighboring groups, even in the absence of geographic barriers. The kinship systems, in other words, were functioning as something analogous to what geneticists call population structure, maintaining the genetic distinctiveness of different groups within a broadly connected continental population. This is not a coincidence. The kinship systems and the associated rules about who could marry whom existed in part to manage the genetic and social relationships between groups in a way that served both social and biological functions. The moiety systems that divide many Aboriginal communities into two halves, each of which must marry out of the group rather than within it, ensure a minimum degree of outbreeding and genetic diversity that prevents the inbreeding problems associated with very small, isolated populations. The complexity of kinship systems in many Aboriginal Australian cultures, which can involve multiple named categories and intricate rules about which categories are appropriate marriage partners, represents a sophisticated social technology for managing genetic diversity in a small population context over very long time periods. The intersection of this social technology with the biological data is one of the places where Aboriginal Australian culture most clearly reads as the product of tens of thousands of years of refinement in a specific ecological and demographic context. You cannot develop a kinship system this complex by accident. You cannot maintain it for tens of thousands of years without significant institutional and cultural infrastructure. The kinship system is itself a kind of deep technology, a social machine for managing the population genetics of a community in ways that ensure long-term viability, and its sophistication is directly proportional to the time over which it has been developed and tested. One of the most striking things about the comparison between Aboriginal Australian and other ancient genomes is the extremely deep roots of the divergence between Aboriginal Australians and all other non-African populations. The genetic distance between Aboriginal Australians and, say, Europeans or East Asians is vastly greater than the genetic distance between any two non-Aboriginal, non-African populations. This is exactly what you would expect if Aboriginal Australians diverged from the main stem of the out-of-Africa dispersal very early, before the population that would eventually give rise to all other non-African populations had itself diversified. It means that the founding population of Aboriginal Australia was not a branch from an already diversified non-African population, but a very early split from the main trunk, which then developed entirely separately for 60,000 years or more, while the rest of the non-African human world was going through the enormous demographic and cultural transformations of the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the historical period. In molecular genetic terms, the separation between Aboriginal Australians and all other non-African populations is so deep that it requires placing it at roughly the time of the out-of-Africa dispersal itself, or possibly before. Some analyses have found that when you look at the total genetic distance between Aboriginal Australians and other populations, and then compare it to the genetic distance between different African populations, the pattern is more consistent with Aboriginal Australians having diverged from other non-Africans very early in the dispersal, possibly before the population that founded all other non-African populations had left Africa, than with them being simply an early branch of a single later dispersal. This is a subtle distinction, but it has significant implications. It raises the possibility that there was an earlier dispersal of modern humans out of Africa, one that predated the main dispersal wave and that contributed significantly to the founding of Aboriginal Australia, while the later main dispersal wave contributed primarily to the founding of all other non-African populations. This would reconcile several otherwise puzzling features of the genetic data. It would explain why Aboriginal Australian genomes appear so much older, in terms of their divergence from a common ancestor with other populations, than the dates commonly assigned to the main out-of-Africa dispersal. It would explain why the signals of early modern human presence in the Middle East, Greece, and China, places where anatomically modern human remains have been found at dates significantly earlier than the main dispersal is supposed to have occurred, appear in multiple separate locations rather than along a single coherent route. And it would explain the population Y signal in Amazonian genomes, which might reflect a connection to this earlier dispersal wave rather than to the main dispersal wave that crossed Beringia. It would not, to be clear, change the fundamental picture of Aboriginal Australians as among the most ancient modern human populations outside Africa. It would make them even more ancient in certain respects than the standard account, while placing their ancestry within a more complex framework of multiple early human movements rather than a single event. The blood would still be the oldest. It would just have gotten there in a story even more intricate than the one we thought we were telling. The landscape of Australia itself participates in this story in ways that are not purely metaphorical. The continent's extreme age means that it carries in its rocks and soils and water systems evidence of processes and events that have no analogue anywhere else on Earth. The ancient shield of the Western Australian Craton, some of the oldest exposed continental crust on the surface of the planet, creates conditions in certain areas where groundwater has been circulating through fractured rock for millions of years, and where the chemistry of that water and the microbial communities living in it represent biological systems with no close equivalents anywhere in the accessible biosphere. The life that lives in the deep subsurface aquifers of the Australian interior is in some cases so ancient and so isolated that it represents evolutionary lineages that diverged from their surface relatives tens of millions of years ago. Australia is not just geologically old. It is biologically old in its deep parts, in the places where life has been accumulating and diversifying in isolation since before the separation of the continent from Gondwana. This biological antiquity of the continent provides a kind of context for the biological antiquity of the human occupation. The people who have been here for 65,000 years are newcomers by the standards of the continent's deeper biology, but in human terms, they are so deeply embedded in this landscape that the relationship between them and it has the character of something more fundamental than habitation. The landscape has shaped the culture as completely as the culture has shaped the landscape. The song lines map a country that the songs have partly made, in the sense that the active management of the landscape through fire and water and selective harvesting over 65,000 years has created the specific ecological character of particular places that the songs describe. The country is, in a very real sense, a co-production of the land and the people who have lived on it. The fire management story is one of the clearest examples of this. Aboriginal Australians practiced controlled burning across the continent for tens of thousands of years, and the ecological landscape of pre-colonial Australia was partly the product of those burns. The mosaic of habitats that many species depended on, the patchwork of open grassland and dense scrub and woodland at different stages of succession, was maintained by the regular application of fire at specific times and places in ways that maximized biodiversity and productivity across the landscape. When that management was disrupted by colonization and the displacement of Aboriginal communities from their country, the landscape changed. Species that depended on specific habitat types created by the fire mosaic declined. The fuel loads that had been kept manageable by regular burning accumulated until they reached levels that produced catastrophic wildfires with intensities far beyond anything the pre-colonial fire regime would have generated. The ecological consequences of the interruption of traditional fire management are still playing out in the form of the devastating bushfire seasons that Australia has experienced in recent decades. This is not a romantic idealization of an unchanging traditional practice. The fire management systems evolved over time and varied by region and by ecological conditions. They were not uniform across the continent, and they were not perfect. But they were functional and they were effective over very long time periods, which is a standard of ecological sustainability that no other land management system in the world has achieved. The fact that they were systematically disrupted and dismissed by colonizers who replaced them with land management practices that have produced progressively worsening ecological outcomes is one of the clearest examples of the cost of ignoring indigenous knowledge in favor of an imported framework whose practitioners did not understand the specific conditions they were dealing with. The relevance of this to the contemporary world is not subtle. The climate crisis that is now reshaping the conditions of human life globally is in significant part a crisis of land and fire management, of water management, of the kind of long-term ecological thinking that the industrial model of resource extraction has systematically failed to develop. The knowledge systems that Aboriginal Australians developed over 65,000 years in direct and sustained engagement with the specific conditions of the Australian continent represent one of the most extensive and most thoroughly tested bodies of practical ecological knowledge in existence. Recovering, preserving, and applying that knowledge, in partnership with the communities who hold it, is not sentimentality about the past. It is one of the most pragmatically useful things that could be done to address the challenges of managing the Australian landscape in the face of a destabilizing climate. The broader point that this specific case illustrates about the practical value of long-accumulated indigenous ecological knowledge is increasingly recognized in the scientific literature, even if it remains imperfectly implemented in policy. The concept of traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes abbreviated TEK, has over the past few decades moved from the margins of conservation biology into the mainstream, driven by the accumulating evidence that indigenous communities often have precise and accurate knowledge about ecological processes and species behaviors that formal scientific surveys have missed, that this knowledge is the product of continuous observation over long time periods that scientific surveys cannot replicate, and that the management practices derived from this knowledge have track records of ecological sustainability that dwarf anything the industrial era has produced. What Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems offer in this context is a case study at the extreme end of the timescale. 65,000 years of systematic observation and active management of a specific landscape. No other example in the world comes close to matching that combination of temporal depth and cultural continuity. The fact that this knowledge exists and is accessible imperfectly and incompletely due to the damage done by colonization, but still accessible through the communities who have maintained it, and through the research programs that are working in partnership with those communities to document and preserve it, is one of the most significant scientific and cultural resources on the planet. The blood is the carrier of this story, not in a purely metaphorical sense. The genetic data that documents the antiquity of Aboriginal Australian ancestry is literally carried in the blood of living people, and the ancestral signatures in that blood point back toward the full depth of that 65,000-year history, including the chapters that are not yet fully understood, the ghost populations and the unexplained connections, and the signals that keep appearing in the data and demanding explanations that the current models cannot yet provide. The blood knows things that the models do not. The job of the models is to catch up. The archaeology of Australia has its own set of anomalies, findings that do not fit neatly into the accepted timeline and that keep generating debate because the implications of taking them seriously extend beyond what the current consensus is prepared to accommodate. Some of these anomalies are more robustly documented than others, and it is important to distinguish between those that represent genuine uncertainty within mainstream archaeology and those that exist at the more speculative margins of the field. Both kinds exist, and both are worth discussing, but with different levels of confidence attached to them. The more robustly documented anomalies cluster around the question of when various technologies and practices appeared in Australia relative to when they appeared elsewhere. The grinding of seeds and plant foods, which was long thought to be a Neolithic innovation associated with the beginnings of agriculture, has now been documented at sites in Australia dating to around 65,000 years ago, making Australian evidence for seed grinding among the oldest in the world. Ground stone tools, including axes with polished edges, appear in Australian sites dated to between 45,000 and 65,000 years ago, predating the oldest comparable evidence from Europe or the Middle East by tens of thousands of years. This does not mean that Australians invented these technologies and that they spread to the rest of the world, but it does mean that the simple model in which technological innovations developed in certain regions and then diffused outward to peripheral areas, with Australia as one of the last to receive each innovation, is simply incorrect for at least some categories of technology. The implication is that some of the technologies we associate with the Neolithic Revolution and with the agricultural period were in fact developed much earlier, in Australia or in the populations ancestral to Australians, and that the story of technological development in human prehistory is more complex and more geographically diffuse than the diffusion from a center model that has dominated the field. This is not entirely surprising given what we know about the cognitive and social capabilities of the people who were crossing open ocean to reach Australia 65,000 years ago. People with that level of planning ability, social organization, and navigational knowledge were not cognitively limited in ways that would have prevented them from developing effective plant processing techniques or from recognizing the advantages of groundstone tools. The rock art record of Australia is another area where the archaeological evidence raises questions that extend beyond current understanding. Australia has one of the richest and most diverse rock art traditions in the world, extending back to at least 28,000 years ago at documented sites, and possibly much further if undated sites include earlier material. The Murujuga or Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia hosts what some researchers have described as the largest concentration of rock art in the world, with hundreds of thousands of individual motifs pecked into the dark surface of the ancient rocks. The imagery includes animals that are recognizably the extinct megafauna that died out in Australia during the first tens of thousands of years of human occupation, including images of the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine, and of the giant wombat, which would not be present unless the artists had actually seen these animals. Some researchers have argued that certain panels at Murujuga depict creatures that have no obvious living or recently extinct analogue, raising the question of whether they represent species that went extinct very early in the human occupation of Australia, and whose depiction, therefore, dates the art to a period more than 25 to 30,000 years ago. These interpretations are contested, and dating the older Murujuga rock art directly has proven technically difficult. But the petroglyphs, images pecked into rock rather than painted, are in many cases exposed to open sky weathering that makes direct dating challenging with current methods. The imagery itself, the content of the panels, is not contested. The extinct species depicted in recognizable form are there. The question is only when they were made, and the most conservative possible interpretation, that they were made from memory or from existing images rather than from life, still requires them to predate the extinction of the species depicted by some mechanism. The Bradshaw paintings, known to the Gwayon people of the Kimberley in Western Australia by the name Gwayon, represent another art tradition with unusual characteristics. These paintings, found across the Kimberley region and into Arnhem Land, depict human figures and animals in a style quite different from the more familiar broad-brush X-ray style paintings of Arnhem Land, or the stencils and engravings of other regions. The Gwayon figures are elegant and elongated, often depicted in dynamic poses that suggest movement, wearing elaborate headdresses and what appear to be decorative garments or body ornaments. The style is distinctive enough that when the British naturalist Joseph Bradshaw first described them in 1891, he initially suggested they could not have been made by Aboriginal Australians, because they did not match his ignorant and prejudiced expectations of what Aboriginal art should look like. The Gwayon paintings have no close stylistic parallel in any other rock art tradition in Australia or elsewhere. Attempts to date them directly have been complicated by the difficulty of dating rock paintings that contain no organic material suitable for radiocarbon analysis. Indirect dating methods, including the analysis of wasp nests built over the paintings and the analysis of weathering patterns, have produced a range of estimates. Some researchers have suggested ages of 40,000 years or more for the oldest panels. Others have argued for much more recent dates. The debate remains unresolved, but the imagery itself, the sophisticated depiction of human figures in elaborate ornamentation, is consistent with a culture that had developed a highly refined aesthetic tradition and a sophisticated material culture involving decorative items of a kind that would require skilled craftsmanship and potentially long distance trade to obtain the raw materials. What these anomalies collectively suggest is that the cultural and technological history of the people who inhabited Australia is richer and more complex than the standard archaeological narrative has captured, partly because the archaeology of Australia has been less thoroughly investigated than that of Europe or the Middle East, partly because the specific conditions of the Australian environment make certain kinds of evidence harder to preserve and harder to date, and partly because a cultural bias toward treating Aboriginal Australian cultures as static and unchanging has sometimes influenced what questions researchers thought to ask and what interpretations seemed plausible. The story of how those biases developed and how they have been challenged is itself an important part of the scientific history here. For most of the 20th century, Australian archaeology was dominated by an implicit model in which Aboriginal culture was seen as essentially unchanged since the initial settlement of the continent, a kind of living fossil of early modern human culture that had not developed or diversified in meaningful ways during the intervening thousands of years. This model was not supported by the evidence, but it was strongly consistent with colonial ideological frameworks that classified Aboriginal Australians as primitive and unchanging as a way of justifying their dispossession. The actual evidence of cultural change, technological development, and regional diversity within Aboriginal Australian archaeological records was consistently underemphasized or interpreted in ways that minimized its significance. The shift toward a more accurate understanding of the richness and complexity of Aboriginal Australian cultural history began in earnest in the 1970s and 1980s, as Aboriginal Australians increasingly participated in the research that affected their history, and as a younger generation of archaeologists with different theoretical commitments began working with the Australian record. The findings that emerged from this shift, including the earlier and earlier dates for the initial occupation, the evidence for sophisticated technology in the oldest archaeological layers, the documentation of the ecological knowledge systems and their effectiveness, all of these were not new data in the sense of being facts about the past that had not existed before. They were new framings of evidence that had always been available, but that had been interpreted through a lens that obscured rather than illuminated what it showed. This has relevance beyond Australia, because similar dynamics have operated in the archaeology and ethnography of Indigenous cultures worldwide. The tendency to see change, development, and sophistication where they existed in European prehistory, and to see stasis, simplicity, and primitiveness where they existed in Indigenous cultures globally, has produced a systematically distorted picture of human history, in which most of the actual story, the story of the vast majority of human experience across the vast majority of human time, has been either invisible or misrepresented. The correction of that distortion is ongoing and incomplete, but it is happening, driven by better tools, better theoretical frameworks, and, crucially, the active participation of Indigenous communities and scholars in the research that constructs the narrative of their own past. One of the most recent and in some ways most surprising chapters of the Australian story concerns the relationship between Aboriginal Australians and the rest of the world during the historical period, specifically in the centuries before European colonization. For a long time, the standard account treated Aboriginal Australia as essentially isolated from the broader human world from the time of the last ice age, sealed off by the surrounding ocean from the trade networks and population movements that connected the rest of the world. This account was not entirely wrong, but it was significantly simplified in ways that the evidence does not support. The Macassan contact, now well documented, is one demonstration of this. For at least several centuries and possibly longer before British colonization, fishermen and traders from Makassar, in what is now Sulawesi, Indonesia, made regular seasonal voyages to the northern coast of Australia to harvest trepang, the sea cucumber, which was valued in Chinese cuisine. These voyages were not incidental or rare. They were a systematic, annual commercial enterprise that involved large fleets of boats, established campsites along the Australian coast, relationships with specific Aboriginal groups, and the exchange of goods including cloth, tobacco, rice, and metal implements. The Macassans and the Aboriginal communities of Arnhem Land and the Gulf of Carpentaria developed sustained relationships that influenced language, ceremony, material culture, and trade networks. Words from Makassarese and Malay appear in several northern Aboriginal languages. Ceremonial designs incorporate motifs that appear to reflect Macassan influence. The dugout canoe, a technology that does not appear in the archaeological record of most of Aboriginal Australia before the historical period, was adopted in northern regions from Macassan models. The Macassan contact demonstrates that Aboriginal communities in the north were not passive recipients of occasional outside influence, but active participants in a regional trade network that connected Australia to the broader world of Southeast Asian maritime commerce. They negotiated terms, they maintained relationships, they selectively adopted elements of outside culture while maintaining the integrity of their own. They were not isolated. And there are hints, less well documented and more contested, of contacts that reach even further. Some researchers have found what they interpret as evidence of contact between northern Aboriginal groups and traders from Southeast Asia or India in periods that predate the well-documented Macassan contact. The presence of certain plant species in northern Australia that appear to have non-native origins but that predate European introduction, and that some researchers have argued were introduced by Asian traders, is one element of this case. The appearance of certain cultural elements with possible parallels in South Asian or Southeast Asian traditions is another. These arguments are preliminary and contested, and the evidence is difficult to interpret unambiguously, but they fit within the broader picture of a northern Australia that was connected to regional maritime networks for a much longer period than the simplistic isolation model would suggest. The picture that emerges from all of this, from the genetics, the archaeology, the oral traditions, the ecology, the contact history, is one of a culture and a people of extraordinary depth and complexity. Not static, neither unchanging nor isolated in the simple sense, but rooted in a continuous relationship with a specific place over a span of time that has no parallel anywhere else in the human world. The things that seem impossible, the blood markers that point in directions the models did not predict, the oral traditions that preserve accurate memories of geological events tens of thousands of years old, the ecological knowledge systems refined over 60 millennia, these are not impossible at all. They are the expected products of what happens when human beings live in continuous cultural and biological relationship with a specific landscape for 65,000 years, without the wholesale disruption that has characterized the history of every other inhabited region of the planet. What is impossible, or should seem impossible once you understand what it means, is that this story was dismissed and distorted for so long, that the people who carry the world's oldest blood were classified as primitive, that the knowledge systems refined over 65,000 years were treated as superstition and fantasy, that the oral traditions preserving accurate records, older than any written document, were ignored, that the ecological management practices maintaining continental-scale biodiversity were disrupted in favor of imported systems that have produced progressively worsening ecological outcomes. The impossible thing is not the ancient blood. The impossible thing is the scale of the misrecognition. And yet here we are, at a point in the investigation where the science is catching up to what the culture always knew. The genetics confirm the antiquity. The archaeology confirms the sophistication. The ecology confirms the effectiveness of the management. The geology confirms the accuracy of the memory. The impossible blood turns out to be exactly what it is: the biological record of the longest continuous human story on Earth, written in molecules in the bodies of people who are still here, still connected to country, still practicing, however imperfectly and partially, the knowledge traditions that their ancestors developed in this place over a span of time that encompasses virtually the entire existence of modern humanity outside of Africa. The sun rises differently over country that has been watched and known and loved for 65,000 years, not because the light is different, because the watching is different. Because the knowledge of what the light means, how it falls on this particular rock formation at this time of year, what that angle of illumination tells you about what is happening in the ecology around you, what ceremony is appropriate for this moment in the seasonal cycle. That knowledge has been refined and transmitted across more human lifetimes than there are years in the written historical record of the entire rest of civilization. There is a way of knowing a place that can only be produced by being in it, attending to it, learning from it, and transmitting what you have learned for 65,000 years. What that produces is not just knowledge. It is something closer to understanding at a depth that has no equivalent in any other human tradition on Earth. There is a specific conversation that has been happening in the genetics community for the past decade, one that is not widely covered in popular science writing, that gets at the heart of what makes Aboriginal Australian genomes so scientifically significant and so difficult to fit into existing models. It is a conversation about the structure of human genetic diversity globally, about how that structure should be modeled, and about what the shape of the data tells us about the deep history of the human species. And Aboriginal Australian genomes are central to this conversation in a way that makes their study not just interesting for what it reveals about Australia, but important for what it reveals about everyone. Here is the basic issue. When you take a very large sample of human genomes from around the world and analyze them using the standard population genetics tools, you get a picture of human genetic diversity that has a specific shape. Non-African populations are less diverse than African populations, which is consistent with the out-of-Africa bottleneck, the period when a relatively small founding population left the continent and gave rise to all non-African people. Within non-African populations, the diversity decreases as you move geographically further from Africa, which is consistent with a serial founder model in which each population was founded by a subset of the population that came before it, with each founding event reducing diversity. This pattern, called isolation by distance, is well established and robust. But Aboriginal Australian genomes do not fit neatly into this pattern. They show levels of diversity that are higher than expected for a population that should, if the model is correct, represent one of the most distant and therefore most bottlenecked populations from the African source. And they show patterns of within-population structure that suggest the founding population was not a single small group, but a genetically diverse collection of individuals representing multiple lineages from the source population. This is not what you get from a single founder event involving a small number of people. This is what you get from a large, genetically diverse founding population, or from multiple waves of founding, or from sustained contact with a genetically diverse external source over a long period following the initial foundation. The most straightforward explanation for this pattern is that the founding population of Aboriginal Australia was simply larger and more genetically diverse than the founding populations of other non-African regions. Not because Australia was a magnet for multiple separate migrations, but because the coastal migration route that brought people to Australia was different in character from the routes that populated other regions. The coastal route, following the shoreline of the Indian Ocean from the Horn of Africa through the Arabian Peninsula and South Asia to Southeast Asia, was a route along which people could move relatively quickly without requiring the extreme cold weather adaptations that would have been necessary for populations moving north into Europe or Central Asia. Moving along a coastline that remained broadly similar in its basic ecological character from one end to the other was technologically easier than moving into radically different environments. It allowed larger groups to move together. It maintained connections between successive waves. And it left a population in Australia that retained more of the genetic diversity of the original out-of-Africa source than the populations that moved along more challenging routes into more demanding environments. This is a plausible explanation, and it does not require any exotic hypotheses. But it requires something important, which is that the coastal migration route was not a desperate trickle of survivors making their way slowly around the rim of the Indian Ocean, but a substantial movement of genetically diverse people along a productive coastal corridor, moving fast enough and in numbers large enough to eventually cross open water and found a continent-scale population. This reimagination of the coastal migration as a demographically substantial movement rather than a marginal survival event has implications that extend beyond Australia, including to our understanding of the genetic history of South Asian populations and of the populations of Southeast Asia and the islands between the mainland and Australia. The genetic signatures of the coastal migration, the traces of the founding population that moved along the Indian Ocean rim, are buried in the genomes of multiple living populations across a very wide geographic range. They are most clearly preserved in Aboriginal Australian genomes, because those genomes have not been heavily overwritten by subsequent migration events, but they are also present in more diluted and partially overwritten form in some South Asian and Southeast Asian populations. Identifying and extracting those signatures, tracing the route of the coastal migration, understanding its timing and its composition, this is one of the frontiers of current human population genetics. The implications of this work extend in unexpected directions. One of the most interesting is the question of what happened to the populations along the coastal migration route after the initial dispersal was complete. Modern South Asian populations show patterns of genetic diversity that include a very ancient substrate, sometimes called the ancestral South Indian or ASI component in genetics literature, that appears to be related to the populations that passed through South Asia during the coastal migration. This ancient substrate was subsequently mixed with, and in most populations heavily diluted by, the arrivals of farming populations from the Middle East and steppe pastoralist populations from Central Asia during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. But it is detectable, and it is most clearly preserved in isolated populations in southern India and in the Andaman Islands. The Andaman Islanders, an indigenous population living on a remote archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, are one of the most genetically distinctive populations in the world. Their ancestry appears to be almost entirely derived from the ancient coastal migration component, barely touched by the subsequent waves of migration that transformed the genetics of South Asian mainland populations. Like Aboriginal Australians, they represent a population that has been relatively isolated for a very long period and has therefore preserved the genetic signatures of the founding migration event more clearly than surrounding populations. And like Aboriginal Australians, their genomes show unexpected patterns of diversity and unexpected connections that point toward a more complex founding history than the simplest possible model would predict. The parallels between the situations of Aboriginal Australians and Andaman Islanders are striking. Both are island or island continent populations whose isolation has preserved ancient genetic signatures. Both have been the subject of intense scientific study that has repeatedly produced findings that complicate the prevailing models. Both are communities with living cultural traditions that are deeply affected by the scientific debate about their ancestry and history. And both have had deeply troubled relationships with the scientific institutions that study them, relationships shaped by the history of colonial anthropology and its legacy of treating indigenous people as objects of study rather than as participants in the production of knowledge about themselves. The Andaman Islanders have, in some respects, experienced this more acutely than even Aboriginal Australians, because some Andamanese groups, particularly the Sentinelese, have maintained such complete isolation that any scientific study is effectively impossible, and would require the kind of coercive intervention that is both ethically unacceptable and physically dangerous. The Jarawa and Sentinelese people have chosen, actively and demonstrably, to have nothing to do with the outside world, and their right to make that choice has been upheld, imperfectly and with ongoing violations, by the Indian government. The fact that they carry in their blood genetic signatures of enormous scientific importance does not create any obligation on their part to make themselves available for study, and the attempts that have been made to observe them, document them, or otherwise engage with them, against their explicit rejection of such engagement, represent one of the clearest examples of scientific interest coming into conflict with fundamental human rights. This is a tension that runs through the entire field of ancient and indigenous genomics. The scientific value of the information available in the genomes of isolated and long-established indigenous populations is real and substantial. But that value does not override the rights of the people who carry those genomes to determine how, when, and by whom their genetic material is studied. The history of genetics research on indigenous populations includes many cases where these rights were violated, where blood samples or other biological materials were collected without genuine informed consent, where the resulting research was conducted and published without benefit sharing, and where the findings were used in ways that the source communities found harmful or offensive. This history has understandably created deep mistrust between many indigenous communities and the genetics research community, a mistrust that is now slowly and imperfectly being addressed through the development of new ethical frameworks for indigenous genomics research. The framework that is gradually emerging from this process is built around the principle of indigenous data sovereignty, the idea that indigenous communities have the right to govern the collection, ownership, and application of data derived from their members, including genetic data. Several formal documents and declarations have articulated this principle, and an increasing number of genetics research projects are being designed and conducted in accordance with it, building in community governance of research decisions, community ownership of data, benefit sharing, and the return of research findings in forms that are accessible and useful to the communities involved. This shift is not just ethically important, it is producing better science, because research conducted in genuine partnership with indigenous communities benefits from the community's knowledge of their own history and ecology, can access information that would not be available to outside researchers working alone, and produces findings that are more accurately contextualized within the living cultural and historical context that gives them meaning. The collaboration between geneticists and Aboriginal Australian communities that produced the ancient genome studies of the 2010s was conducted under frameworks of this kind, involving negotiation with community representatives about research questions, methods, sample sources, and publications. The results were more informative and more appropriately interpreted as a result. And the relationship between the research teams and the communities involved has continued to develop in ways that are producing ongoing collaborative research into questions that the communities themselves have identified as important and relevant to their own understandings of their history. Among those questions is one that touches directly on the deepest mystery in this story: the question of the population Y signal, and what it tells us about the connection between the deep ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and the first people of the Americas. This question matters to Aboriginal Australian communities not just because it is scientifically interesting, but because it touches on the question of who their deep ancestors were and where they came from before Australia, and it connects to oral traditions in some Aboriginal communities that describe journeys and origins that the standard model of the out-of-Africa coastal dispersal does not obviously accommodate. These oral traditions are not straightforward accounts of migration routes. They are cosmological narratives about the origins of people and country that encode information in the form of story and symbol rather than linear historical description. Extracting the historical information embedded in them requires the kind of collaborative, interpretive work that can only be done by people who understand both the traditions and the scientific frameworks, which is exactly the kind of work that Indigenous scholars and interdisciplinary research teams are beginning to do. The results so far have been suggestive rather than definitive, but they point toward the possibility that some Aboriginal traditions preserve memory in the characteristic indirect and symbolically encoded form of oral knowledge of the population history that the genetics are revealing. The idea that oral traditions could preserve accurate information about events and population movements that occurred 60,000 years ago is not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. Given what we know about the accuracy of Australian oral traditions in preserving geographical information from the period of sea level rise after the last glacial maximum, if oral traditions can accurately encode information about coastlines that were flooded 10,000 years ago, the question of whether they could also encode information about population origins and movements from an earlier period is at least worth asking. The answer might be no. The kind of specific geographical detail that makes the sea level rise stories verifiable is harder to maintain in accounts of population movement that lack obvious physical anchors in the present landscape. But it might also be yes, encoded in forms that have not yet been decoded or even recognized as historically relevant by researchers who lack the appropriate cultural context for interpretation. This is one of the frontiers of the field. It is speculative, genuinely uncertain, and dependent on the development of research collaborations and interpretive tools that do not yet fully exist. But it is not irrational speculation. It is the kind of question that emerges naturally from taking seriously the evidence for the extreme time depth of Aboriginal oral knowledge systems, combined with taking seriously the evidence for deep population connections that the genetics are revealing. If both are real, and the evidence suggests that both are, then the question of whether they are connected in a single, coherent historical narrative is at least worth pursuing. The place where all these threads converge, the genetics and the archaeology and the oral traditions and the ecology, is not a place of final answers. It is a place of productive uncertainty, of multiple lines of evidence pointing toward a story that is becoming clearer but that is still far from complete. The blood is genuinely old. The models were genuinely inadequate. The culture genuinely carries information that has no parallel anywhere else on Earth. And the people who carry all of this, the living Aboriginal Australians navigating a contemporary world while remaining connected in ways that are always partial and always difficult and always meaningful, to an inheritance 65,000 years deep, those people are the reason the investigation matters in a way that goes beyond scientific interest. Understanding the deep history of Aboriginal Australia is not just an exercise in filling in gaps in the human timeline. It is a necessary component of understanding what it means to be human, what is possible when people live in sustained relationship with a specific place over very long time periods, and what is lost when those relationships are violently disrupted. The impossible blood carries a possible future, a set of possibilities about how humans can know and inhabit and sustain the world that we have barely begun to explore. The science is one way of approaching those possibilities. The living culture is another, older, deeper, and in many respects wiser way. The most productive paths forward are the ones that bring these approaches into genuine conversation, neither dismissing the science nor subordinating the culture to its categories, but finding the places where they illuminate each other and holding those places carefully, as long as it takes, to understand what they are showing. The deep genetic signature of archaic admixture in Aboriginal Australian blood opens onto a question that is rarely asked directly, but that sits underneath much of the scientific debate. What were these archaic humans actually like? Not in terms of their molecular profiles, but in terms of what it was like to be them, to encounter them, to live alongside them, and eventually interbreed with them in ways that left permanent marks on the founding populations of an entire continent. This question is almost entirely unanswerable from the evidence we have, but it is worth asking because the asking reveals something important about the nature of human prehistory and about the complexity of the encounters that shaped the founding ancestry of the world's oldest living culture. The Denisovans are known to us almost entirely through their DNA. A finger bone and a few teeth from a cave in Siberia, a partial skull found in Tibet, and the genomes extracted from those fragments. From the genomes, we know that they were a distinct lineage from both Neanderthals and modern humans, diverging from the Neanderthal branch perhaps 400,000 years ago. We know that they were physically distinct from modern humans and from Neanderthals in ways that are suggested by the skeletal remains, although those remains are too few and too fragmentary to give us a complete picture of what they looked like. We know that they had a large range, extending from Siberia to at least Tibet and probably through much of Southeast Asia. We know that they interbred with modern humans in at least two separate events, one that contributed to the Denisovan ancestry of Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations, and another that contributed to a less understood Denisovan signal in East Asian populations. We know that one of the things they gave us was a high-altitude adaptation that has allowed Tibetan peoples to live at elevations that would be physiologically dangerous for people without that genetic variant. What we do not know is what the encounter between the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and the Denisovans was like, whether it was peaceful or violent or some of both, whether it was sustained over long periods or brief and incidental, whether the two populations lived in proximity for generations before the intermixing happened, or whether the genetic exchange was the result of a single or a few contacts between groups that otherwise maintained separate existences, whether the Denisovans recognized the modern humans as similar to themselves or experienced them as something fundamentally other, whether the modern humans saw the Denisovans in similar terms to how they saw members of their own group or experienced them as a different kind of being altogether. These questions cannot be answered. The evidence does not exist to answer them. But the fact that the encounter happened, and happened in a way that left a genetic contribution representing a few % of the total genome of every Aboriginal Australian alive today, tells us something about the nature of the event. A genetic contribution of a few % requires not a single episode of interbreeding but sustained contact and integration. It requires that the offspring of the initial encounters were incorporated into the reproducing population, that they had children and grandchildren who were raised within the group, that their Denisovan ancestry was not treated as something that disqualified them from full membership in the community. The genetic record, in other words, is a record of inclusion, however that inclusion was structured and whatever it meant to the people involved. This matters for understanding the nature of the founding population of Aboriginal Australia. These were not purely modern humans in the sense of being biologically identical to present-day humans everywhere else. They were people who carried within their genomes contributions from at least one and possibly more archaic human populations, contributions that represented not contamination or aberration but integration, the absorption of genetic material from populations that had been living in the environments that the founding migrants were moving through. The modern humans who ultimately reached Australia and founded the populations that became Aboriginal Australian cultures were themselves composite, the result of a mixing process that had been happening along the migration route for some time before the final crossing. The biological reality of this composite ancestry raises interesting questions about the nature of early human identity and group membership. If the people who crossed to Australia carried Denisovan genetic contributions, and if those contributions represented a meaningful fraction of their genome, did they identify in any way with the Denisovan populations they had descended from in part? Or were the Denisovan genetic contributions so completely integrated into what they understood as their own identity that the question of separate ancestry did not arise? These questions are unanswerable in any direct sense, but they point toward the broader reality that human identity and group membership have always been more fluid and more biologically entangled than the categories we use to describe them suggest. The physical environment that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians encountered when they arrived was as alien in some respects as the archaic humans they had interbred with along the way. Australia had been evolving in biological isolation for 80 million years. Its fauna and flora, while not entirely without analogues to what the arriving humans would have seen on the migration route from Africa, were distinctive in ways that must have required significant adaptation of existing knowledge. The predators were different, the prey animals were different, the plants were different, the ecological rhythms were different, the weather patterns were different. The astronomical situation was different. A sky in the southern hemisphere presents the stars and seasonal patterns in arrangements that an experienced navigator familiar with the northern sky would find unfamiliar. The adaptation to this new environment, whatever process it involved and however long it took, produced the specific ecological knowledge system that has been refined and transmitted across all the subsequent millennia. But that adaptation process itself must have been challenging, involving learning the hard way which plants were safe and which were toxic, which animals were dangerous and which were manageable, where water could be found in this new and unfamiliar landscape, how the weather systems of this new continent worked. The people who accomplished this adaptation, who figured out the ecology of Australia well enough to survive and then thrive, and then build a continent-spanning knowledge system around what they had learned, were doing something that required exactly the same cognitive capacities and cultural sophistication that allowed their ancestors to cross the open ocean in the first place. They were not passive adapters. They were active problem solvers, applying the cultural tools they had brought with them to a set of problems that those tools had not been specifically designed for, and that required significant innovation to solve. The genetic evidence for population structure within Aboriginal Australian populations suggests that this adaptation happened in a specific way, not as a single uniform process across the continent, but as a regionally differentiated set of processes, with different groups in different parts of the continent developing specialized knowledge and adaptations to the specific ecological conditions of their territories. The diversity of languages, cultures, and ecological knowledge systems that characterized Aboriginal Australia at the time of European contact was not a primordial given. It was the result of 65,000 years of regional differentiation and local specialization within a population that had originally been more uniform. The population structure that geneticists observe in modern Aboriginal Australian genomes reflects this long history of regional differentiation, the development of distinct subpopulations with distinct genetic profiles corresponding to the distinct cultural and ecological adaptations of different regions of the continent. This regional differentiation was not isolation. The trade networks and ceremonial exchange systems that connected Aboriginal Australian communities across the continent maintained genetic and cultural exchange between regionally distinct populations, preventing the kind of severe inbreeding that would accompany complete isolation, while allowing regional distinctiveness to develop and be maintained. The balance between regional differentiation and continental connectivity is reflected in the genetic data, which shows both the clear evidence of population structure and the genetic signatures of the long-range exchange that kept the population connected. This balance was managed through exactly the social institutions, the kinship systems, the ceremonial exchange networks, the diplomatic relationships that are documented in the ethnographic and historical record of Aboriginal Australian cultures. The continental scale of these networks is itself remarkable. Trade goods moved across the entirety of the continent in ways that can be traced archaeologically. Certain types of stone used for toolmaking are found at sites hundreds of kilometers from their geological source. Shells from the coast appear at inland sites far from any ocean. Ochre from specific sources with distinctive chemical signatures appears at sites far from those sources. Seeds, feathers, and other organic materials also moved across these networks, although the archaeological preservation of organic materials is less complete. The networks were not just economic but ceremonial and diplomatic, maintained through the relationships between groups that the kinship systems and intergroup ceremonial practices created and sustained. What this meant for genetic exchange is that even as regional populations were developing distinct genetic profiles through the adaptation to local conditions, the trade and ceremonial networks were ensuring a degree of gene flow that prevented complete regional divergence. People moving along the trade routes, participating in ceremonies at distant sacred sites, forming marriage alliances with groups from other regions, were carrying genes as well as goods and ceremonies. The continental population remained genetically connected even as it diversified. This is the pattern that the genetics reveal, and it is consistent with the social and cultural record of how Aboriginal Australian communities organize their relationships across space. The archaeological record of this continental connectivity is most clearly visible in the distribution of certain artifact types that appear across very wide geographic ranges in periods when they can be dated. The distribution of backed artifact technology across most of the continent within a relatively short time period, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, is one example. The distribution of particular ceremonial knowledge and associated art traditions across wide geographic areas is another. The distribution of the dingo across the continent within a few hundred years of its introduction is a third. These are not the patterns of a fragmented, isolated set of small populations. They are the patterns of a networked continental society, in which information, goods, and genetic material moved across the entire territory through established social mechanisms. This picture of pre-colonial Aboriginal Australian society as a networked continental system is quite different from the colonial image of small, isolated bands struggling to survive in a hostile environment. The actual situation was more like a civilization in the original sense of the word, a society organized at a continental scale with established systems of governance, exchange, knowledge, transmission, and territorial management, expressed not in the form of cities and states but in the form of kinship networks and ceremonial systems and ecological management practices that operated across the entire continent. The organizational principle was different from what European colonizers recognized as civilization, which led them to conclude it did not exist. But the conclusion was wrong. The organization was real. It was just organized on different principles that had been refined over 65,000 years of successful operation in conditions that no European colonial system has ever been tested against on anything like the same timescale. The contrast between the 65,000-year track record of Aboriginal Australian continental management and the 200-year track record of Australian colonial management is instructive. In 65,000 years, Aboriginal Australian management maintained ecological diversity, prevented catastrophic wildfires through controlled burning, maintained viable populations of most native species, preserved water resources, and transmitted accurate knowledge about the landscape to successive generations, without interruption. In 200 years, colonial management has produced multiple catastrophic fire seasons, the extinction of approximately 100 native species, the degradation of soil and water resources across much of the productive land, and the disruption of the ecological management systems that maintained the continental ecology before colonization. The track records are not comparable. This is not an argument for any particular political position. It is an observation about the demonstrated effectiveness of different knowledge systems and management approaches over different time periods. The knowledge system that produced the longer track record of successful ecological management is the one that should be most seriously consulted as Australia navigates the ecological challenges of the 21st century. The scientific validation of that knowledge system's antiquity and accuracy that the genetics and the archaeology and the geology are providing is useful not as validation for its own sake, but as a lever for changing the practical weight given to Aboriginal ecological knowledge in the decision-making processes that determine how the continent is managed. The story that the oldest blood tells is ultimately a story about time and what becomes possible within it. Given enough time, attention accumulates into knowledge. Knowledge refines into wisdom. Wisdom embeds itself in culture. Culture transmits itself across generations. And what began as individual acts of observation and experimentation, the first Australians learning which plants were safe, where water was hidden, how to read the weather, how to burn in ways that regenerated rather than destroyed the vegetation, accumulates across 65,000 years into a body of understanding about a specific place that is as deep and as precise as anything human beings have ever developed about anything. The blood carries all of it, not in any mystical sense, not in the sense that the specific knowledge is encoded in the DNA, but in the sense that the people who carry the DNA are the people who carry the culture, the language, the ceremony, the connection to country that is the living form of 65,000 years of accumulated human understanding. The biology and the culture are inseparable in the way that any people and their history are inseparable. The history lives in the people. The people embody the history, and the history, in this case, is the longest and deepest human history anywhere on Earth. To sit with this fact is to sit with something that resists the usual ways of making sense of historical knowledge. We are accustomed to thinking about ancient history as something that is over, that happened in the past, that we can study and learn about, but that we cannot touch or be touched by except in abstract ways. The ancient history of Aboriginal Australia is not like that. It is not over, it is present. The cultures that have been continuous for 65,000 years are still here, still practicing, still generating new knowledge within the frameworks that 65,000 years of refinement have produced. The ancient and the present are not separated by the passage of time. They are the same thing, continuously unfolding, continuously being added to, continuously being transmitted from the people who remember to the people who are learning. The blood is the evidence of this continuity at the molecular level. The culture is the evidence at the social level. The country is the evidence at the ecological level, bearing in its soils and its water and its fire history and its species composition, the marks of 65,000 years of human presence and management. All three levels of evidence point toward the same conclusion, that what has been happening in Australia for 65,000 years is one of the most remarkable human achievements in the history of the species. Not remarkable because it was dramatic, or because it produced monuments or texts that the rest of the world could easily read and recognize. Remarkable because it was sustained, because it worked, because it produced and preserved and transmitted a depth of knowledge and a quality of relationship with a specific place that has no equivalent anywhere in the human world. The oldest blood on Earth is extraordinary, not because of what it contains that should not be there, but because of what it is, the biological record of survival, adaptation, knowledge accumulation, and cultural transmission across a span of time that encompasses virtually the entire existence of modern humanity as a global species. It is the deepest document of the human story, and the people who carry it are still writing in it, still adding new chapters to the longest narrative in the history of our species, still here, still connected to the country that shaped their ancestors, and that their ancestors shaped in return, Across 65,000 years of the most extraordinary human achievement that has ever been quietly, patiently, persistently unfolding at the bottom of the world. The mathematics of human memory is something that most of us have never seriously reckoned with. We are accustomed to thinking about memory as individual, personal, biological, limited to the span of a single life, and we are accustomed to thinking about collective memory as dependent on writing or other external recording technologies that can preserve information beyond the biological limits of individual human minds. We rarely think about what happens when a community maintains an oral tradition with sufficient rigor and institutional support that the information it carries can survive not just across a few generations but across hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of generations. The mathematics of this are not intuitive, and the implications, once you actually run through them, are striking. A human generation is roughly 25 to 30 years. Over 65,000 years of continuous human occupation. The culture that has inhabited Australia has passed its knowledge through something on the order of 2,000 to 2,600 generations. This is an enormous number of transmission events, and the question of whether any information could survive that many transmissions without degrading beyond recognition is a legitimate one. The answer depends entirely on the transmission mechanism. If the transmission is unstructured, if knowledge is simply passed informally from older to younger people without specific cultural technologies to ensure accuracy, then the degradation rate would indeed be too high for very old information to survive recognizably intact across such a span. But Aboriginal Australian oral traditions are not unstructured. They are transmitted through an elaborate system of ceremony, song, formal instruction, and repeated practice in context that represents exactly the kind of high-fidelity transmission mechanism that could, in principle, preserve specific information over very long time periods. The songs that encode ecological and geographical information are not free-form narratives that can be modified at will. They are formal compositions in which specific words are attached to specific places and events in ways that are regulated by the cultural authority of the tradition. Deviation from the established form is recognized and corrected. The transmission of the songs happens in the context of ceremony that reinforces their importance and their requirement for accuracy. The same information is encoded in multiple overlapping forms. In song, in ceremony, in visual art, in the physical practice of moving through the landscape, which provides redundancy that reduces the risk of information loss from the failure of any single transmission event. This is why the geological accuracy of stories about events tens of thousands of years old is not as surprising as it initially seems. The stories are maintained within a system designed specifically to prevent the kind of casual drift and embellishment that would otherwise degrade them beyond recognition over long time periods. They are, in a technical sense, extremely error-corrected transmissions. And the fact that we can verify some of them against independent geological and oceanographic data shows that the error correction system works. The scale of this achievement in information technology is comparable to, and in time depth far exceeds, anything produced by written cultural traditions. The oldest continuous written tradition in the world, the literary tradition of ancient Egypt, goes back approximately 4,000 years. The continuous oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia go back, on the evidence of the geological stories alone, at least 10,000 years, and on the evidence of the genetic and archaeological record, at least 65,000 years. This is a technology of cultural information storage and transmission that has no equal anywhere in the human world, and it has been producing and refining itself for longer than every other information technology in human history combined. When the first written texts appeared in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Aboriginal Australian oral traditions were already 50 to 60,000 years old. The alphabets that made widespread literacy possible in the ancient Mediterranean world were invented roughly 8,000 years after Aboriginal Australians were already transmitting accurate descriptions of the landscape they would eventually encounter after the sea level rise drowned their coastal territories. The printing press, the internet, the entire infrastructure of written information technology that modern civilization depends on, all of it together is less than 1,000 years old. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia are 65 times older than writing. This perspective does not make writing less valuable or the achievements of literate civilizations less significant. It simply puts them in a context that illuminates how recent they are and how much of human cultural achievement preceded them. The story of humanity that is told from within literate civilization is inevitably biased toward the 5,000 years of the written record, toward the achievements and the events that left textual traces. The vast majority of human cultural achievement, the 60,000 years before writing, is largely invisible within this framework, accessible only through archaeology, genetics, and the living traditions of the communities that maintained cultural continuity across that period. Aboriginal Australians are one of the primary windows through which we can see that invisible majority of human cultural time. The content of what can be known through those traditions is not fully accessible from outside them. There is a body of sacred knowledge within Aboriginal Australian cultures that is not available to outsiders, that is transmitted only within specific ceremonial contexts to properly initiated individuals, and that represents the deepest accumulated wisdom of cultures that have been thinking about human existence, about the nature of the world, about the proper relationship between people and country, for 65,000 years. We do not know what is in that knowledge. We know it exists, and we know from the observable quality and accuracy of the non-sacred knowledge that the overall system is capable of preserving and transmitting sophisticated information with high fidelity. Beyond that, what the sacred knowledge contains remains properly private. This raises a question that is worth sitting with, even if it cannot be answered. If a culture has been thinking about the deepest questions of human existence for 65,000 years, developing frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual consciousness and the natural world, between the living and the dead, between the present and the past, between the human and the non-human, and if that thinking has been transmitted with sufficient care to preserve it across that entire time span, what has been discovered? What has been learned, tested, refined, and preserved that is not available anywhere else in human thought? The answer is not accessible from outside the tradition. But the question is worth taking seriously, and the taking it seriously is itself a significant departure from the colonial framework that classified all of this as superstition not worthy of investigation. The ecological implications of this accumulated knowledge are, as already discussed, practically significant in the context of contemporary environmental challenges. But there are other dimensions of what has been learned that are potentially important in different ways. The relationship to time that Aboriginal Australian cultures embody, a relationship in which past, present, and future are not linearly separated, but are understood as aspects of a single, ongoing reality accessible through the proper practice of ceremony and relationship, represents a philosophy of temporal existence that is genuinely different from the linear temporal frameworks that dominate Western thought. Whether this represents a philosophical achievement of independent value or a different metaphysical starting point that happens to be less useful for certain purposes than the linear model, or something in between, is a question that requires genuine engagement with the tradition to even begin to formulate correctly. The point is not that Aboriginal Australian philosophical frameworks are superior to Western ones, or that they should replace them. It is that they are 65,000 years old and contain accumulated insight from 65,000 years of human beings thinking carefully about the most fundamental questions, and that dismissing them without serious engagement is an intellectual choice with a high potential cost. If even a fraction of what has been learned in those 65,000 years of careful observation and reflection about the nature of time, consciousness, country, and human existence turns out to be genuinely insightful in ways that the shorter traditions have not yet reached, the cost of the dismissal would be enormous. The rock formations of Australia carry another dimension of this story that sits at the intersection of geology, mythology, and science in a way that is characteristic of the whole inquiry. Some of the most sacred sites in Aboriginal Australian traditions are locations where geological features, specific rock formations, particular configurations of stone and water and sky, are understood as the physical manifestations of events that occurred during the dreaming, the foundational period in which the world was shaped and given its present form. The geological interpretation of these sites, when it has been pursued in collaboration with the knowledge holders of the relevant traditions, has sometimes produced remarkable convergences between the mythological account of the site's formation and what geologists understand about how it was actually formed. These convergences are not always complete and are rarely interpretable in a simple one-to-one way. The dreaming accounts are not geological reports in narrative form. They encode information about geological processes in a language of spirits and sacred animals and transformative events that requires interpretive translation rather than literal reading. But the kernel of accurate geological understanding that sometimes sits inside the mythological account, when identified, suggests that the traditions have been carrying observational knowledge about geological processes, possibly including knowledge accumulated from witnessing actual geological events in the distant past, encoded in a form that allows it to be transmitted across time periods far too long for any other kind of record. The Flinders Ranges in South Australia are one location where this kind of analysis has been attempted. The Adnyamathanha people of the region have traditions about the landscape that describe specific geological features in terms of events during the dreaming, and some of these accounts have been analyzed in conjunction with the geological history of the area. The results are suggestive of genuine encoded geological knowledge, consistent with the broader pattern of accurate environmental observation that characterizes the oral traditions more generally. Similar analyses are being pursued at other sites around the country, in each case requiring the kind of collaborative engagement with knowledge holders that ensures that the inquiry respects the cultural protocols around sacred knowledge while pursuing the scientific questions that the evidence raises. What all of this amounts to is a convergence of evidence from multiple independent disciplines: genetics, archaeology, geology, linguistics, ecology, astronomy, pointing toward the same conclusion: that the human culture that has inhabited Australia for 65,000 years represents something genuinely singular in the human story. Not just the oldest living culture, but the deepest, the most thoroughly tested by time, the most precisely calibrated to the specific conditions of a specific place, and the most fully continuous in its relationship to the country that has shaped it. The blood that carries the genetic record of this culture is the oldest modern human blood outside Africa. The traditions that carry the cultural record are the oldest living traditions anywhere. The knowledge encoded in both the biology and the culture is the most ancient knowledge of any kind that is still accessible to living human beings. And yet this singular, irreplaceable, ancient thing was nearly destroyed within the space of 200 years. The colonization of Australia was one of the most rapid and thorough dispossessions in the history of human settlement, carried out with legal frameworks that literally denied the existence of Aboriginal sovereignty by declaring the continent terra nullius, empty land, as if the people who had been there for 65,000 years were not there and never had been. The biological, cultural, and ecological consequences of that dispossession continue to unfold. Many Aboriginal language communities no longer have enough fluent speakers to maintain full transmission of the knowledge their languages carry. Many sacred sites have been damaged or destroyed, some through ignorance and some deliberately by mining or development. The communities that were forcibly displaced from their country and relocated to settlements in unfamiliar landscapes were severed from the specific knowledge of specific places that constitutes the most precise and practically important portion of traditional ecological knowledge. The recovery from this damage is not complete, and in some respects cannot be complete. Languages extinct with their last speakers carry knowledge that is gone. Ceremonies that were not transmitted because the social context for their transmission was destroyed take knowledge with them. Sacred sites destroyed by dynamite or mining machinery cannot be restored. But the recovery that has happened, the languages revived, the ceremonies reclaimed, the connections to country re-established, the political and legal recognition slowly achieved, testifies to the same resilience that allowed this culture to survive ice ages and megafaunal extinctions, and the radical transformation of the landscape by sea level rise over 65,000 years. The culture that survived all that has the capacity to survive colonization too, and the science that is documenting its antiquity and its achievements is one small part of the broader project of recognition that this survival requires. The ancient blood circulating in living bodies is not just a scientific resource. It is a living inheritance, carried in people who are navigating the complexities of contemporary life while remaining connected to something older and deeper than anything else in the human world. The fact that this inheritance exists, that it survived what was done to try to destroy it, is in its own way as remarkable as any of the specific findings that the science has produced. It is the most fundamental demonstration of the oldest fact about human beings, that we are survivors, that we carry our history in our bodies and our cultures, and that the stories written in the oldest blood on Earth are not finished. They are still being told in the communities of people who have been telling them for longer than any other human beings anywhere. The specific question of what exists in the blood that should not be possible, the thing that serves as the organizing mystery of this whole investigation, deserves to be addressed directly now that the broader context has been established, because the answer is more nuanced and more surprising than the framing of the question might initially suggest. It is not that there is a single impossible thing, a single genetic marker or ancestral signature or molecular peculiarity that defies explanation. It is that when you look at the complete picture, the genomic architecture of Aboriginal Australian populations, combined with their antiquity of settlement and the specific patterns of diversity and connection they show, the aggregate of what you find is a set of findings that collectively exceed what the standard models predicted, and that individually point toward processes and connections that the standard models did not account for. The Denisovan admixture is high, not merely present, but quantitatively significant, representing a larger contribution from an archaic human population than any other modern human population carries. The diversity within Aboriginal Australian populations is higher than expected for the geographic position of Australia in the out-of-Africa dispersal model, suggesting either a larger founding population or a more complex founding history, or sustained contact with external populations over longer periods than the isolation model allows. The depth of divergence from other non-African populations is greater than the standard timeline accommodates cleanly, suggesting either an early split from the main dispersal population or a contribution from an earlier dispersal wave that predated the founding of other non-African populations. The statistical connections to other populations, particularly to Andaman Islanders and to certain ancient South African populations and to the population Y signal in some Amazonian groups, suggest a network of ancestral connections that the standard model does not fully explain. None of these findings individually is impossible in a strong sense. None of them requires invoking supernatural causes or impossibly ancient dates or mechanisms that violate any known laws of biology. But they collectively represent a body of evidence that strains the standard model significantly, and that has consistently pushed the field toward more complex reconstructions of early human population history than the dominant view of the past half-century would have accommodated. The blood is not impossible. The model was too simple. And this is the genuinely important insight, the one that extends beyond the specific case of Aboriginal Australia to the broader project of understanding human prehistory. We have been telling a story about where we came from that was built on incomplete evidence, was shaped in ways both conscious and unconscious by the cultural biases of the researchers who told it, and that systematically underestimated the complexity, the antiquity, and the geographic range of early human movement and mixing. The data that Aboriginal Australian genomes provide is one of the primary challenges to this oversimple story. And the challenge is not just a matter of adding complexity to an otherwise accurate framework. It is a challenge to the fundamental picture of a single, linear, relatively simple dispersal, producing the current distribution of human genetic diversity through straightforward population dynamics. The real story, the one that the data is pushing us toward, involves multiple dispersal events, some of which predated the main dispersal by tens of thousands of years. It involves sustained contact along the coastal corridors that connected the early dispersal populations. It involves interbreeding with multiple archaic human populations in multiple locations, producing composite founding populations whose genetic legacies we are still tracing. It involves population replacements and absorptions that happened multiple times in multiple regions, obscuring earlier patterns and making the reconstruction of deep history from modern genomes an exercise in looking through multiple layers of imperfectly transparent glass at something that was never simple to begin with. Australia is the place where this complexity is most clearly visible, because it is the place where the standard model has the greatest difficulty accounting for what the data shows, and because it is the place where the founding population has been least disrupted by subsequent migration and mixing. Other regions also show complexity, also show signals that the simple model does not fully explain, but those signals are harder to read because they are overlaid with so many subsequent layers of demographic history. Australia, precisely because of the isolation that was previously used as a justification for treating Aboriginal Australians as a marginal and peripheral case in the human story, turns out to be the place where the foundations of that story are most clearly exposed. The periphery was always the center. The oldest blood was always the most important record. We were just not reading it carefully enough. The implications of reading it now, of bringing the full weight of modern genomic science to the questions that this blood raises, extend to our understanding of what happened in the intermediate regions between Africa and Australia as well. The populations of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Southwest Pacific all carry, in varying degrees and with varying degrees of obscuring overlay from later migrations, elements of the same deep ancestry that is most clearly preserved in Aboriginal Australian genomes. As ancient DNA analysis from archaeological sites in these regions becomes more possible and more systematically pursued, the picture of the coastal migration that ultimately led to the peopling of Australia will become clearer. And as it becomes clearer, it will inevitably also clarify the story of what happened to the populations that did not continue all the way to Australia, but who settled in South Asia and Southeast Asia and left descendants who are still there, whose ancient ancestry connects them to the same founding stock as the people who went on to cross the open ocean and reach the bottom of the world. This is the human story, not the story of a single group of people moving in a single direction at a single time and producing a simple branching tree of subsequent populations. The story of a species that was always moving, always mixing, always leaving traces of itself in unexpected places, and that spent the vast majority of its existence doing things that the written record is too short and too partial to show. The blood of Aboriginal Australians is one of the best available windows onto that larger story, and what it shows, when viewed with the full range of tools now available, is a past far older, far more connected, and far more surprising than the standard account has allowed. The future of this investigation is in some ways the most interesting part. The tools of ancient genomics are improving rapidly, with new techniques making it possible to extract and sequence DNA from remains in conditions that previously made such analysis impossible. The coverage of ancient genome data from different regions and time periods is expanding. Computational methods for analyzing population structure and demographic history are becoming more sophisticated. The collaborative frameworks for indigenous genomics research are developing in ways that are making it possible to ask and answer questions that were previously blocked by the history of exploitative research. And the integration of genomics with other lines of evidence, archaeology, linguistics, ecology, and oral knowledge systems, is producing interdisciplinary analyses that are more informative than any single discipline could achieve alone. What will this expanded investigation reveal? Nobody knows yet, but the direction of the findings so far suggests that the surprises will continue. Each time a new dataset is analyzed, each time a new ancient genome is sequenced, each time a new region or population is brought into the analysis, the picture becomes more complex, and the depth of human interconnection across space and time becomes more apparent. The history of humanity is longer than we thought, more tangled than we thought, more globally distributed in its patterns of movement and mixture than the textbook accounts suggest. And the blood of Aboriginal Australians, the oldest modern human blood outside of Africa, is one of the primary documents from which that longer, more tangled, more distributed history is being read. The continent at the bottom of the world, ancient in its rocks and ancient in its first human inhabitants, is proving to be not a peripheral footnote to the human story, but one of its central chapters. The people who have been here longest are teaching the rest of the world something important about where everyone came from, and about what it means to be here long enough to know a place in the way that only 65,000 years of continuous inhabitation and attention can produce. The blood is old, the knowledge is older, and neither one is finished with its story yet. There is a specific kind of attention that emerges from staying in one place for a very long time, not the attention of a tourist or a researcher or an administrator who has come to observe and leaves when the observation is complete, but the attention of someone whose grandparents and their grandparents and every ancestor back for more generations than there are years in the written record was also here, was also watching this same country, was also learning from the specific way that water moves through this particular creek, from the specific angle of light on these specific rocks at this specific time of year, from the specific sequence of flower and fruit and seed that marks the turning of the seasons in this place as opposed to any other place. That kind of attention, multiplied by 2,000 generations, produces something different in kind, not just in degree, from any form of knowledge that can be acquired by shorter means. It produces the ability to predict what the country will do in conditions that have not been seen within the memory of any individual. To know from the pattern of events in a single season that the next 3 years will be dry and that certain adjustments to movement and food practices will be necessary. To know which trees will still be productive during a drought because their root systems reach deep enough to find water that shallower-rooted plants cannot access. To know where water can be found under the surface of apparently dry ground in the specific geology of specific places, because this knowledge was learned by someone who found it and transmitted it specifically so that it would still be known when the next drought came. This is not romantic. This is functional. This is the kind of knowledge that keeps people alive in conditions that would otherwise be lethal. And it is knowledge that could not have been accumulated in any shorter time span than the one over which it was actually accumulated. You cannot compress 65,000 years of careful attention into a 5-year study or a 10-year research program. You can learn from it, you can try to document it, you can work to preserve it and apply it. But you cannot reproduce the process that generated it in any shorter time than the process itself took. It is irreplaceable because of its age, not in spite of it. The global context for this irreplaceability is one of accelerating loss. Languages are going extinct at a rate that has no precedent in the historical period. The indigenous languages that carry the accumulated ecological and cultural knowledge of their speaker communities are disappearing faster than they can be documented or revitalized, taking with them knowledge systems that have been refined over periods of time that are, in many cases, comparable to the Aboriginal Australian timescale, if not as extreme. Every language extinction is an irreversible loss of a knowledge system, a way of knowing and relating to the world, a body of accumulated insight about the specific place and conditions in which that language developed. Once a language is gone, what was carried only in that language is gone too. This loss is happening in Australia as well. Of the approximately 250 Aboriginal Australian languages that existed at the time of European colonization, roughly 40 are still spoken by significant numbers of people with full fluency and transmission capacity. Another 100 or so have some speakers, but the transmission to younger generations is incomplete and insecure. The rest are extinct or surviving only in documentation, accessible as historical records, but no longer as living knowledge systems. The knowledge that was encoded specifically in those languages, the specific ways of describing specific aspects of the country that were developed in those languages over thousands of years, is gone or going. The loss is catastrophic from a knowledge preservation standpoint, but it is not total. The languages that survive are real and living and are being transmitted to new speakers and new generations in communities that are actively committed to maintaining them. The knowledge systems they carry are not frozen museum exhibits. They are living frameworks that are being applied and developed and adapted to the conditions of the present as they have been applied and developed and adapted to the conditions of each present throughout the 65,000 years of their existence. The culture is not a fossil. It is a living organism, wounded but not dead, capable of continuing to grow and respond and produce new knowledge in the way that it always has. And the science that is documenting its depth is providing something that the culture can use as well as contribute to validation. External validation of what Aboriginal Australian communities have always known about the antiquity and the importance of their traditions. Evidence, in the language that the wider society is most likely to take seriously, that the knowledge systems are real, that the oral traditions are accurate, that the connection to country is not metaphor but documented historical fact. This validation does not come from outside and cannot be the primary basis for Indigenous cultural self-understanding, because the culture does not need external validation to know what it is. But in the practical context of legal and political struggles for recognition, for land rights, for the protection of sacred sites, for the right to participate in decisions about the management of country, external scientific validation can be a useful tool in the hands of communities who already know the truth and who need the broader society to acknowledge it. The investigation is not over. The questions are not answered. The models are still being revised. The data is still being collected and analyzed. The collaborative research frameworks are still being developed. The recovery of Indigenous knowledge and language is still underway. The political and legal recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and rights is still incomplete. All of this is happening simultaneously, imperfectly, with setbacks and complications and failures, as well as with progress. But the direction of travel is toward greater understanding, greater recognition, greater integration of what was known and what is being discovered. The blood at the center of this story is circulating in the bodies of people who are navigating all of this in real time, who are raising children in communities that are trying to balance the claims of the contemporary world with the obligations of an ancient inheritance, who are dealing with the practical and political consequences of colonization while also maintaining the ceremonies and relationships and knowledge practices that connect them to the 65,000 years that came before. This is not a simple or comfortable position. It is the position that history has placed them in, and they are navigating it with the same resourcefulness and adaptability that their ancestors navigated everything else that 65,000 years has brought. The oldest blood on Earth is not a relic. It is not a museum piece or a scientific specimen or a metaphor for something simpler than what it actually is. It is living blood in living people, carrying the most ancient genetic record of modern human existence outside Africa, belonging to communities that have maintained cultural continuity across a span of time that is, in human terms, simply astonishing. The things in it that should not be possible according to the old models are not impossible at all. They are simply older and more complex, and more deeply connected to the broader human story than the models allowed for. And as the models improve, as the science catches up to the reality, what they are revealing is not just the history of one people in one place at the bottom of the world. They are revealing the complexity and the richness and the sheer improbable magnificence of the whole human story, written in the oldest script, carried in the oldest blood, preserved in the oldest continuing culture on the face of the earth. The conversation about what the old models missed, and why they missed it, is one that the scientific community is still having. And it is not just a conversation about Australia. It is a conversation about the entire framework that has been used to tell the story of human prehistory, about the assumptions built into that framework, and about who was centered and who was marginalized in the telling. The standard model of human dispersal, with its clean narrative of a single wave moving out of Africa along a coastal route and populating the world in a relatively orderly sequential fashion, was a model built primarily on evidence from the populations that the scientific establishment most intensively studied, which were the populations of Europe and East Asia that most closely resembled the populations doing the studying. The populations of Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Aboriginal Australia, the Pacific Islands, and the Americas were studied less, understood less, and accommodated less thoroughly in the models that emerged from the research. This is not simply a matter of data availability, although data availability was certainly part of it. It is also a matter of the assumptions that shaped the research questions, the populations that were treated as representative versus peripheral, and the interpretive frameworks that were applied to the data that was collected. A model built primarily on European and East Asian genomics will naturally fit those populations well. It will necessarily fit more poorly the populations that were not used to build it, particularly if those populations have demographic histories that differ significantly from the histories of the populations that were centered in the model building process. This is exactly what happened with Aboriginal Australian genomes. When researchers finally began analyzing them in detail using the full range of modern genomic tools, they found that the models fit them poorly in specific ways that had diagnostic implications, ways that pointed toward aspects of the real demographic history that the models had not captured, because they had not been designed to capture them. The data did not fit the model. But rather than concluding that the model was correct and the data was anomalous, which would have required dismissing real findings from real analyses, the more honest conclusion was that the data was revealing genuine features of the actual demographic history that the model had missed. This is how science is supposed to work. Models are provisional. Data constrains models. When data conflicts with model predictions, the model should be revised to accommodate the data, not the other way around. The revision that Aboriginal Australian genomic data requires of the standard model is not minor. It is a substantial revision that affects the dating of the initial dispersal, the structure of the founding events, the nature and extent of archaic admixture, and the pattern of subsequent connections between populations that the model treated as fully isolated from each other. These revisions, collectively, move the model closer to the real complexity of early human population history, which is the direction that scientific models should move as evidence accumulates. The parallel revision happening in Australian archaeology, the revision from a picture of static, unchanging Aboriginal cultures to a picture of dynamic, developing, regionally diverse cultures with long histories of technological innovation and ecological management, is driven by similar dynamics. Earlier archaeological work was done within a framework that expected Aboriginal Australian cultures to be primitive and unchanging, and it tended to find what it expected because the interpretive frameworks applied to the evidence were shaped by that expectation. When those frameworks were challenged, initially by Aboriginal Australian scholars and community members, and then by a new generation of archaeologists with different theoretical commitments, the reinterpretation of the existing evidence and the collection of new evidence within a different framework produced a radically different picture, not because the underlying reality had changed, because the way of looking at it had changed. This is a broader lesson that the Australian case exemplifies with particular clarity. The story we tell about the past is always shaped by who is telling it, from what position, with what assumptions, and for what purposes. When the story of Aboriginal Australian prehistory was told by colonial scholars operating within a framework that categorized Aboriginal Australians as primitive and unchanging, the story that emerged was a story of primitiveness and unchangingness. When that story is challenged by Aboriginal scholars and by non-Aboriginal scholars working in genuine partnership with Aboriginal communities and replaced with a story built on the evidence rather than on the prejudices, a radically different picture emerges. The past did not change. What changed was the quality and honesty of the inquiry. The same dynamic applies to the genetic evidence. The story of human dispersal that was told before Aboriginal Australian genomes were analysed in detail was a story built on partial evidence that underrepresented the populations and the demographic processes that those populations represent. As the evidence base has expanded to include more Aboriginal Australian data, more ancient DNA from Southeast Asia and South Asia, more systematic analysis of the populations along the coastal migration route, the story has changed. Not because the underlying history changed, but because we are finally reading more of the actual document rather than the partial transcript that was available before. And the document is not finished. There are still enormous gaps in the ancient DNA record for Southeast Asia and South Asia, regions that are crucial to understanding the coastal migration. but where the tropical climate has destroyed most organic material suitable for DNA extraction. There are still Aboriginal Australian communities whose genetic data has not been collected, or whose data has been collected but not yet published, because the collaborative research process that these studies require takes time to develop properly. There are still archaeological sites in Australia that have not been adequately investigated, either because they are in remote locations or because previous research programs lack the resources and the community partnerships necessary to conduct the work responsibly. The picture will continue to change as the evidence base continues to expand. What will not change, barring the discovery of some fundamental error in the current analyses, is the basic finding that Aboriginal Australians carry the world's oldest modern human ancestry outside Africa, that this ancestry includes genetic contributions from archaic human populations that modern people elsewhere carry in smaller quantities or not at all, and that the patterns of genetic variation within Aboriginal Australian populations reflect a demographic history more complex than the standard model allows. These findings are robust across multiple independent analyses, using different methods and different datasets. They represent the established scientific consensus on the genomic history of Aboriginal Australians, a consensus that will be refined and extended but not overturned by future research. The other thing that will not change is the cultural and historical significance of this finding for the communities whose blood it describes. For Aboriginal Australians who have maintained, through colonial suppression and dispossession, and all the forces that have been brought to bear against the continuation of their cultures, the traditions and ceremonies and knowledge systems that connect them to their 65,000-year inheritance, the scientific confirmation of that inheritance's antiquity and authenticity is a form of recognition, not validation in the sense that the culture needed external validation to know its own worth, but recognition in the sense that the tools and frameworks of a society that spent 2 centuries dismissing Aboriginal culture are now producing findings that confirm what Aboriginal culture has always known about itself. The recognition is incomplete. Science can confirm the antiquity of the ancestry and the accuracy of certain oral traditions. It cannot substitute for the legal, political, and social recognition that Aboriginal communities are still fighting for. It cannot restore what was destroyed. It cannot undo the damage done to communities and individuals by 2 centuries of colonial violence and dispossession, but it is something. It is a contribution to the process of reckoning that Australian society is still working through, the process of honestly confronting the history of colonisation and its consequences and determining what it means, practically and morally, to live on a continent where the original inhabitants have been here for 65,000 years, and where their dispossession was achieved within the span of the last 2 centuries. The geological timescale of Aboriginal Australian ancestry makes the 2 centuries of colonisation look very small. Not insignificant, because the damage done in that time was enormous, but small in the sense of being a recent event in a much longer story. The 65,000 years that came before colonisation were not empty. They were full of the same complex, dynamic, developing human life that characterizes every era of human existence, shaped by the specific conditions of the specific place and time, producing specific cultural and technological achievements that were precisely calibrated to those conditions. The 2 centuries of colonization interrupted and damaged this story, but did not end it. The story continues. It continues in the communities that are maintaining and reviving their languages, that are fighting for their land rights, that are working with scientists and archaeologists in genuine collaborative partnerships that ensure the research serves community interests as well as scientific ones. It continues in the work of Aboriginal scholars who are applying the tools of contemporary academic inquiry to questions about their own history and culture, producing interpretations that are both rigorous by the standards of their disciplines and informed by the cultural knowledge that only an insider can bring. It continues in the ceremony and the law and the relationship to country that have persisted despite everything that has been done to interrupt them. And it continues in the blood. The molecular record of 65,000 years of survival, adaptation, mixing, and maintenance that is preserved in the genomes of living Aboriginal Australians is not a historical artifact. It is a present reality, circulating in the bodies of people who are alive today and whose children will carry it into the future. The impossible blood, the blood that contains things the old models said should not be there, turns out to be exactly possible and exactly real. The biological record of the most ancient, most continuous, most deeply embedded human cultural tradition on the face of the earth. The investigation into what it contains and what it means is one of the most important scientific inquiries happening in the world right now. Not because the findings are spectacular in a sensational way, although some of them are genuinely astonishing, but because they are changing the fundamental picture of human prehistory in ways that have implications for everything from our understanding of archaic human diversity to the roots of early human dispersal to the nature and depth of traditional ecological knowledge to the basic structure of the human genomic tree. The peripheral case turns out to be the central document. The oldest blood turns out to be the clearest window. And the culture that has been here the longest turns out to be telling a story that everyone needs to hear. When the light falls in a certain way in the late afternoon on the red rock of the Australian interior, something becomes visible that is not visible at other times of day, in other seasons, at other angles of illumination. Formations that seemed featureless reveal themselves to have texture and depth. Shadows that seemed empty turn out to contain images pecked or painted into the stone. The landscape reveals itself to have been inscribed more thoroughly than was apparent from the surface. This is what is happening with the scientific investigation of Aboriginal Australian prehistory. New tools and new frameworks are changing the angle of illumination. And what had seemed featureless or simple or peripheral is revealing itself to be inscribed, deeply and thoroughly, with a story older and more complex and more central to the human narrative than anyone who was only looking from the outside, in the wrong light, at the wrong angle, could have seen. The blood has been waiting to be read. The culture has been waiting to be heard. The country has been waiting to tell its story through the people who know it best. The people who have been listening to it for longer than any other human beings anywhere on Earth have been listening to anywhere. The conversation between the science and the culture and the country is still in its early stages. But it is happening, and what it is revealing is extraordinary, and what it will eventually make possible, in terms of human self-understanding and the practical knowledge of how to live on this planet, may be more important than anything else that the 21st century has to offer. The oldest blood on Earth is not a mystery. It is a record. The record of a species learning to be human over a span of time so vast that the entire history of what we call civilization is a brief recent footnote. The record of a people surviving every challenge that 65,000 years of living at the bottom of the world could produce. The record of knowledge accumulated and preserved and transmitted across more generations than there are words in any language to describe. The record of the first great human achievement, staying, being here. Knowing this place so well that the place and the people are no longer separable, have not been separable for longer than writing has existed, longer than agriculture has existed, longer than every other culture on Earth has existed in its current form. That is what is in the blood. And it is, when you sit with it long enough to understand what it means, one of the most astonishing things in the world. There is a way of thinking about time that Aboriginal Australian cultures embody, which deserves more careful attention than it typically receives in discussions focused primarily on the scientific findings. Western frameworks of time tend to be linear, with the past behind us and the future ahead, and with the present as a moving point between them. History in this framework is what is behind us, completed and fixed, accessible only through records and inference. The future is what is ahead, open and undetermined. The present is the only moment of actual existence and engagement. Aboriginal Australian temporal frameworks, while varying considerably between different cultural traditions across the continent, often operate with a fundamentally different structure. The dreaming, as already described, is not a past time but an ongoing reality, a dimension of existence that underlies and infuses the present rather than preceding it. Events of the dreaming are not historical events in the Western sense of events that happened and are now over. They are events whose effects are permanently present in the landscape, in the social order, in the proper practice of ceremony. The creation stories are not myths about a distant past, but accounts of a reality that is still active, still shaping the conditions of existence, still accessible through the right practice in the right places. This temporal framework is not simply a different way of understanding the same reality that Western frameworks model more accurately. It may be a different framework for engaging with a reality that is genuinely more complex than the linear model allows. The ecological reality of Australia, a continent where the same places have been inhabited and managed and known for 65,000 years without interruption, is a reality in which the effects of past events are genuinely present in ways that Western frameworks of time do not naturally capture. The effects of fire burns from decades ago are present in the current structure of the vegetation. The effects of management decisions from generations ago are present in the current distribution of water across the landscape. The effects of ceremonial practices from centuries ago are present in the maintained conditions of sacred sites. The past is not behind. The past is here, in the form of its consequences, which are the present conditions that all current action must engage with. The dreaming framework, understood this way, is not mysticism. It is a way of making visible the temporal depth of consequences in a landscape that has been known and managed for 65,000 years. Everything that has happened in this country has left traces. Those traces constitute the present. The dreaming names the reality that the present is saturated with the past, in ways that require acknowledging and engaging with the past as an active reality, rather than treating it as an inert record that can be safely ignored in favor of whatever seems pragmatically efficient in the moment. The practical wisdom embedded in this temporal framework is considerable. A society that understands the present as constituted by the effects of the past, and that therefore understands current practice as constituted by its future consequences, is a society that naturally takes a long-term view of its management decisions. If you know that what you do now will be present in the landscape for your grandchildren and their grandchildren, you make different choices than if you see yourself as acting in a present that is separable from a past that has ended and a future that has not yet begun. The 65,000-year track record of effective ecological management in Aboriginal Australia is not unrelated to this temporal framework. It may be one of its consequences. This is a genuinely different contribution to the human understanding of time and causality, one that has been developed and refined over 65,000 years of application, in conditions where its accuracy was continuously tested against the results of the management it informed. If your temporal framework produces bad management, the ecology degrades, the resources decline, the community suffers, and you revise the framework, or you do not survive to transmit it. If your temporal framework produces good management, the ecology is maintained, the resources are sustained, the community thrives, and the framework is confirmed and transmitted. 65,000 years of this kind of continuous testing produces a temporal framework that has earned its authority in the most direct possible way. The science that is now studying the blood and the archaeology and the ecology of Aboriginal Australia is, among other things, documenting the outcomes of this long test. The blood shows that the population has been here long enough to develop the genetic signatures of 65,000 years of regional adaptation and continuity. The archaeology shows that the technological and cultural sophistication required to manage the continent effectively was present from early in the occupation. The ecology shows that the landscapes managed under traditional fire regimes were more biodiverse and more resilient than the landscapes managed under colonial practices. The oral traditions show that accurate knowledge has been transmitted across the full depth of the occupation. The test has been running for 65,000 years. The results are in. And the results confirm that what Aboriginal Australians have been doing, in this place, for this long, works. The value of understanding this for the rest of the world is not only theoretical, it is practical. The ecological knowledge systems, the temporal frameworks, the management practices that Aboriginal Australian cultures have developed over 65,000 years in this specific place are not directly transferable to every other context. They were developed for Australia. They encode knowledge of Australian ecology, Australian climate patterns, Australian species, and their behaviours. But the principles that underlie them, the principle of attending closely to a specific place over long time periods and adjusting practice based on the results, the principle of understanding current conditions as the product of past events and future conditions as the product of current events, the principle of managing resources to sustain them across generations rather than extracting them for immediate maximum yield, these principles are not specific to Australia. They are general principles of ecological management that have been tested and validated over a time frame that no other knowledge system can match. The conversations that are now happening between Aboriginal knowledge holders and ecologists, between traditional owners and conservation managers, between Indigenous scholars and environmental scientists, are conversations in which the oldest knowledge is meeting the newest tools, and the two are producing understandings that neither could generate alone. These conversations are happening across Australia in the collaborative research programs and the native title agreements and the Indigenous ranger programs and the fire management partnerships that represent the slow, difficult, imperfect, but real process of integrating ancient knowledge with contemporary institutional frameworks. The integration is not complete, and it is not without conflict. The power imbalances between the institutions and the communities are real, and they affect the terms on which the integration happens. But the integration is happening, and the results are accumulating. Each time a fire management program incorporates traditional burning knowledge and produces better ecological outcomes than the program achieved without it, the ancient knowledge is validated again. Each time an environmental water allocation is informed by Aboriginal knowledge of seasonal water movement and produces better ecological responses than the allocation achieved without it, the ancient knowledge is validated again. Each time a conservation plan is built around Aboriginal knowledge of species behavior and habitat requirements and protects more biodiversity than the plan achieved without it, the ancient knowledge is validated again. The validations accumulate. The case for deeper and more genuine integration strengthens. The resistance of institutional frameworks that were built without any expectation of taking Indigenous knowledge seriously gradually weakens in the face of evidence that taking it seriously produces better results. This is not inevitable. The resistance is real, and the forces maintaining it are powerful. But the direction of travel is toward greater recognition, greater integration, greater practical application of the knowledge that 65,000 years of continuous inhabitation of this continent has produced. And the science that documents the antiquity and the accuracy of that knowledge is one of the forces pushing in that direction. The ancient blood at the center of this story is doing something in the contemporary moment that it has been doing for 65,000 years, circulating through the people who carry it, sustaining them, connecting them to their inheritance, enabling them to navigate whatever circumstances their present brings. The circumstances of the contemporary moment are unprecedented in that inheritance. Nothing in 65,000 years prepared these communities for colonization, for dispossession, for the specific challenges of surviving and maintaining cultural integrity in the 21st century. But the resources that the inheritance provides, the adaptability, the resilience, the depth of knowledge, the quality of relationship with country, these are the same resources that have enabled survival and flourishing through every other unprecedented challenge that 65,000 years produced. And so the blood keeps circulating, old in its molecular architecture, renewed in each new generation, carrying forward the record of every encounter and adaptation and survival that brought it to the present. The record of the archaic humans interbred with along the migration route. The record of the open ocean crossing that founded the population. The record of the continental adaptation that produced the first Australian ecological knowledge. The record of the kinship systems that maintained population structure and cultural continuity. The record of the seasonal gatherings that maintained continental connectivity. The record of the gene flow events that introduced new people and new knowledge without disrupting the fundamental continuity of the culture. The record of survival. This is what the blood carries. And when the science reads it as carefully and honestly as it is now beginning to do, what it finds is not impossibility. It finds the record of the possible made actual across a span of time so vast that the usual words for what is and what is not possible stop applying. The blood is old, The people are present. The country is still here. And the story is still being told in the only way that 65,000 years of continuous human existence can be told, by continuing to exist, continuing to know, continuing to care for the country that has cared for these people across the longest stretch of continuous human habitation anywhere on the face of the earth. The question of what it means to know a place across 65,000 years keeps returning because it is the question that has no equivalent anywhere else in the human world. We have records of cultures that have inhabited specific regions for 5,000 years, for 10,000 years in a few cases. We have written histories going back 4,000 or 5,000 years in the most ancient literate traditions. We have archaeological evidence of settlement in specific locations going back longer than that. But we do not have, anywhere else on Earth, a culture that has maintained continuous inhabitation of the same continent, with continuous cultural transmission across a span of time that is 65,000 years long. This is singular. It happened in one place, and the people who embody this singularity are alive, are present, are engaged with the world, and with the investigation of their own past. What does it mean for a culture to carry within itself the memory of the world before the last ice age ended? To have within its oral traditions stories of a time when the coast was 100 meters below its present level, when vast areas of the continental shelf were dry land inhabited by people whose descendants are still in the communities that remember them, when the ecological conditions of the continent were different from what they are today, and when the fauna included species of such strangeness that their absence from the world is itself a kind of loss. The Ice Age megafauna of Australia included animals that have no surviving relatives, creatures whose ecological roles in the pre-extinction ecosystem were filled in ways that are still affecting the structure of that ecosystem today, 10,000 or 20,000 years after their disappearance. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that may preserve memories of these animals, in the form of descriptions of creatures that match extinct species, or in the form of oral accounts of their disappearance, are connecting the living present to a world that existed before the Holocene began. This temporal depth is not decorative. It is not merely interesting as historical curiosity. It has practical implications for how we understand the current ecological state of Australia and what interventions might be most effective in restoring ecological function to landscapes that have been degraded by both the megafaunal extinctions of the past and the more recent ecological disruptions of the colonial period. The removal of keystone species changes the structure of ecosystems in cascading ways that play out over very long time periods. Understanding what the ecosystems of Australia looked like before the megafaunal extinctions, understanding how they functioned and what the ecological roles of the extinct species were, is relevant to understanding the current state of those ecosystems and what they are capable of becoming. Aboriginal Australian traditions may contain encoded knowledge about these pre-extinction ecosystems, in the form of stories about animals that are described as once having been present and now absent, or in the form of descriptions of ecological relationships and processes that no longer exist, but that are consistent with what would have existed in the presence of the extinct megafauna. Extracting this information from the traditions would require the same kind of careful, collaborative, interpretive work that has been applied to the volcanic eruption and sea level rise stories, working with knowledge holders to identify what in the tradition might be referencing ecological conditions that no longer exist, and then cross-referencing those references with the paleontological and paleoecological record. This work is in its early stages, but the potential yield is significant. The connection between memory and ecology that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions embody is a model for a kind of knowledge relationship with the natural world that has no equivalent in the scientific tradition. Science accumulates knowledge through systematic observation and experimentation within the time frame of individual research careers and research programs, typically spanning a few decades at most. The ecological information that can be gathered through this mechanism is real and valuable, but it is limited to a very short window of ecological time, insufficient to capture the dynamics of processes that operate over centuries or millennia. Traditional ecological knowledge systems that have been accumulating observations and refining understanding over thousands of years can, in principle, capture dynamics that science cannot access through its own methods alone. The Aboriginal Australian case, where the time depth of the knowledge system is documented to be at least 10,000 years and maybe significantly longer, represents the most extreme and therefore the most valuable example of this kind of long-term ecological knowledge. The collaboration between scientists and Aboriginal knowledge holders in the management of Australian landscapes is slowly developing, driven both by the growing recognition within the scientific community of the value of traditional ecological knowledge and by the increasing political and legal recognition of Aboriginal rights to participate in land management decisions. Programs that incorporate Aboriginal burning practices into regional fire management are operating in multiple parts of the country. Programs that use Aboriginal knowledge of water sources and movement to inform environmental water allocation decisions are being developed. Programs that use Aboriginal knowledge of species behavior and habitat requirements to inform conservation planning are being implemented. These are early steps in a much longer process, but they represent a genuine shift toward the integration of knowledge systems that is necessary if Australia is to manage its landscapes effectively in the face of a destabilizing climate. The genetic dimension of this integration is also developing. Programs are underway to use the genomic data from Aboriginal Australian populations to improve medical care for Aboriginal communities who face health disparities partly related to the fact that medical genetic research has been heavily biased toward European populations and produces recommendations that are not always appropriate for populations with different genetic profiles. This is a direct and practically important application of the genomic research that moves it from pure scientific interest into the realm of community benefit. The communities whose blood is being studied are gaining something tangible from the research, not just contributing to the scientific knowledge of researchers who will publish papers and move on. The legal implications of the genetic evidence are also significant. Native title legislation in Australia requires Aboriginal communities to demonstrate continuous connection to country in order to have their sovereignty over specific territories recognised. Genetic evidence of continuous habitation, combined with the archaeological evidence of ancient occupation and the oral traditional evidence of specific connections to specific places, provides a more complete and more robust evidentiary basis for native title claims than any of these lines of evidence could provide separately. The antiquity of the genetic record supports the antiquity of the occupation. The specificity of the oral traditions supports the specificity of the connection. The archaeology provides the physical record of habitation at the sites in question. Together, they make a case that is more than the sum of its parts. The practical use of ancient genomic evidence in legal proceedings to support Indigenous land rights claims is a new and developing area of law, and there are legitimate questions about the interpretation and evidentiary weight of genetic data in legal contexts that require careful navigation. But the principle that the genetic record of continuous ancestry in a specific place constitutes relevant evidence of long-term connection to that place is one that is gaining traction in legal frameworks globally, and Australia, given the depth and clarity of its Indigenous genomic record, is one of the places where this principle is being most thoroughly tested and developed. The ethical dimensions of this use of genetic evidence are significant and are actively discussed within both the Indigenous communities and the genetics research community. Who owns the genetic data? Who has the right to use it? In what legal contexts is it appropriate to introduce it? How should the privacy interests of living community members be balanced against the potential legal benefits of using the data to support land rights claims? These are real questions without simple answers, and they are being worked through in the context of ongoing legal and political processes that have stakes far higher than the academic questions about population history that the same data addresses. The person at the center of all of this, the living Aboriginal Australian navigating the intersection of 65,000-year inheritance and 21st century complexity, is doing something that has no historical parallel. Every previous generation of Aboriginal Australians lived in a world where the primary challenges were the natural and human challenges of survival and cultural transmission in a specific landscape. The challenge of navigating the encounter between an ancient culture and a technologically dominant external civilization, of maintaining cultural integrity while also engaging productively with a world that operates by different rules, of using the tools of that external world, including its scientific methods and its legal systems, in service of the cultural and territorial interests that the ancient culture has always had. This is new. It has no precedent in 65,000 years of Aboriginal Australian history, because nothing like it happened before. And yet the people navigating it are drawing on exactly the same resources that their ancestors drew on in every other unprecedented situation that 65,000 years produced. The adaptability that allowed the initial voyagers to cross open ocean and establish a viable population in an unfamiliar continent. The observational acuity that developed precise knowledge of volcanic eruptions and sea level changes and megafaunal behavior. The institutional sophistication that created the kinship systems and ceremonial frameworks necessary to maintain cultural coherence across a continent-sized territory over tens of thousands of years. The resilience that preserved cultural continuity through the megafaunal extinctions, through the dramatic climate changes of the Ice Age and its ending, through the gene flow events of the Holocene that introduced new people and new technologies and new languages without destroying the cultural continuity that had been maintained since the founding. These are the same resources being applied to new circumstances, as they have always been applied to new circumstances throughout the 65,000-year history. The blood carries all of this, the genetic record of survival and adaptation and mixture and continuity across a span of time that encompasses essentially the entirety of modern human existence outside Africa. The specific molecular signatures that point toward archaic admixture and deep ancestral connections and unexpected genomic diversity and unexplained statistical relationships with populations thousands of miles away. The biological heritage of the first people to cross open ocean, to inhabit a continent in isolation from the rest of the human world, to develop a culture so precisely calibrated to a specific place over such a long period of time that the culture and the place are inseparable in a way that has no equivalent anywhere else. This is what is in the blood that should not be possible if you take the old models seriously. But the old models were wrong. The impossible turns out to be the real, and the real turns out to be more extraordinary than the models ever allowed. The oldest blood on Earth is not a curiosity or an anomaly. It is a document, a record, a window, a story, the story of what it means to be here, to stay, to know a place across a depth of time that the human imagination struggles to encompass. The story that began 65,000 years ago, when someone who looked like us stepped onto the shore of a continent at the bottom of the world and decided to stay. That story has not ended. It is still being told in the communities and the cultures and the blood of the people who are still here, who have always been here, who will go on being here, carrying in their ancient blood the living memory of the world's longest human story. The sun that rose over Australia 65,000 years ago, when the first human beings stepped onto its shore, has risen approximately 23 million times since. Each sunrise has illuminated the same ancient rocks, the same red soil, the same species of tree and bird and creature that evolved in this place over 80 million years of continental isolation. And for 65,000 of those sunrises, at minimum, human eyes have been watching, human minds have been attending, human voices have been telling the stories of what they see. The watching has accumulated, the attending has deepened, the stories have grown more precise. And the blood that carries the genetic record of all those watching eyes and attending minds and telling voices is still flowing, still present, still the oldest continuous thread of modern human existence anywhere outside the African continent. That is not impossible. It is exactly what it is. The oldest blood, the deepest stow have been traveling this whole time through a story that is still being written. A story that began before the last ice age, before the megafauna went silent, before the seas rose to swallow the coasts where the first Australians walked, and that continues in the living communities, the living ceremonies, The living languages that have survived everything the past 65,000 years brought. The blood at the center of this journey is not a relic, and it is not a metaphor. It is alive, circulating in the bodies of people who wake up each morning carrying in their cells the most ancient genetic record of modern humanity outside the African continent. And what it contains, when you read it carefully and honestly and with the full weight of the best available science, is a story that changes how you understand not just Australian history, but the entire human story. The findings that feel impossible, the Denisovan admixture that is higher than any other modern population carries, the genomic diversity that exceeds what the standard model predicts for a population in this geographic position, the statistical connections to populations on the other side of the world that keep showing up in the data and refusing to be explained away, the oral traditions that accurately encode geological events from tens of thousands of years ago, none of these are truly impossible. They are simply what the actual history looks like when you look at it honestly. The impossibility belongs to the old models, not to the reality. The reality was always there. It just took the right tools and the right questions and, crucially, the right relationships to become visible. The country that carries this story is ancient, in a way that no other inhabited land is ancient, and the people who have known it longest are its most faithful chroniclers. The science is learning to read what they already knew. The archaeology is uncovering what they already remembered. The ecology is beginning to apply what they already practiced. And the culture itself, wounded but not broken, old beyond any other culture's years but still alive, is continuing to generate the insights and the knowledge and the relationships with country that have always been its defining achievement. If you have been drifting towards sleep through this long journey into deep time, you have been in good company. For 65,000 years, people have been sleeping under these stars, dreaming whatever the minds of the oldest modern humans dreamed, waking to a country that rewarded attention with knowledge and rewarded knowledge with survival. The stars over Australia are the same stars they always were. The country is changed, marked by 2 centuries of disruption, but still recognizably itself in the places where the ancient knowledge is still being applied. And the blood is unchanged, as old as it was 65,000 years ago when the first voyagers reached the shore, carrying in its molecular architecture the record of everything that happened before they arrived, everything they found when they got here, and everything they built in the 65,000 years that followed. The story told in that blood is the longest human story there is. If you found yourself held by it, if some part of it has changed how you think about time, about knowledge, about the relationship between people and place, then consider leaving a thought in the comments below. If these long journeys through the deep past are how you prefer to find sleep, the subscribe button will bring the next one to you without requiring you to search for it. And if you feel moved to support this work, there is a membership option here on this channel that helps keep these long, slow, deep stories coming to you, but none of that is ever required. Watching and listening is always enough. Rest now. The ancient country is quiet under the stars that the first Australians named and mapped and encoded in ceremonies 60,000 years ago. The blood keeps circulating, old and new at once, carrying its impossible record of the longest human survival story ever told. You are part of the same species that did all of this, that crossed open oceans and survived ice ages and remembered volcanic eruptions across 30,000 years of telling. Whatever you are carrying into sleep tonight, it is lighter than that. And tomorrow will begin as all the mornings for 65,000 years began, with the country still here, with the knowledge still transmitting, with the oldest blood on earth still flowing in the veins of the people who know this place better than anyone else ever has or ever will.